Chapter 16 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16. Kara Threatens. Those 2 days were uneasy ones to Kara. He felt no dread of Aneth's final answer, but the waiting for it was wearisome. Their arrangements might easily have been concluded at the last interview had he not been weak enough to defer to the girl's foolish desire to postpone the inevitable. Since he had come from Fedah, the world had been his plaything, and he found it in no way difficult to accomplish those things he determined upon. He had, therefore, acquired unbounded confidence in the powers of Ahtka-Ra's remarkable stone of fortune, which he believed to have a strong influence over all his undertakings. So the Egyptian merely sought to occupy his time to good advantage until he could bring his bride, willing or unwilling mattered little, home to his handsome villa. He sent Tadros to summon the most famous merchants of Cairo to wait upon him, and arranged to have the women's quarters redecorated in regal fashion. He selected many rich silks and embroideries for Aneth's use when she should need them, and secured an increased corps of Arab servants, well trained in their duties, to attend the slightest wish of their new mistress. He realized that the establishment must hereafter be conducted more upon the plan of a modern European household, and that the apartments of the harem must be transformed into parlors, reception halls, and drawing rooms. In marrying Aneth, he determined to abandon all Oriental customs and adopt the manners of the newer and broader civilization. He would exhibit his wife in society, and, through her, gain added distinction. His villa would become renowned for its fêtes and magnificent hospitality. Such a life appealed to his imagination, and a marriage with the English girl rendered it possible. Hatatcha had educated and trained Kara for a purpose, but now her mission, and his oath to fulfill it, were alike disregarded. He had given the matter considerable thought recently, and decided that his love for Aneth Consinor cancelled all obligations to persecute her or her people further. Hatatcha was dead, and forgotten by the world, and her wrongs could never be righted by any vengeance that he might inflict upon her enemies. She could not appreciate the justice of retribution, since her spirit was far away in the netherworld with Anubis, and her body in the tombs of Fedah. He had at first been conscientious in his determination to accomplish his grandmother's will, but a girl's eyes had thwarted him, and Hatatcha had herself proved weak when love assailed her. Even as all his schemes were approaching fruition and his grandmother's revenge was nearing accomplishment, the compelling power of his love arrested his hand and induced him to cast aside everything that might interfere with his prospective happiness. On the afternoon of the second day, he dressed himself carefully, and ordered his chauffeur to be ready to drive him to the Savoy. But as he was about to leave his room, a note was brought to him from Aneth. He tore it open and eagerly read the message. Dear Prince Kara, I am not going to risk another unpleasant interview, because I am anxious we should remain in the future, as in the past, good friends and comrades. But please do not again ask me to marry you, for such a thing is utterly impossible. While I am glad to enjoy your friendship, I can never return the love you profess to bear me, and without love a true woman will not marry. So I beg you will forget that such a thing has ever been discussed between us, and forbear to refer to it again. Your friend, Aneth Consinor. As he read the note, Kara's face grew set and stern, and his dark eyes flashed ominously. He read it a second time with more care, trying to find some word of hope or compromise in the frankly written epistle, but there was none. He experienced a sensation of disappointment and chagrin, tinged with considerable astonishment. Strange as it may seem, he never for a moment anticipated such a positive refusal. But his nature was impetuous and capricious, and presently anger drove all other feelings from his heart, and the anger grew and expanded until it was hot and furious, and took full possession of him. Perhaps it was the blow to his self-esteem that was most effective in destroying the passion he had mistaken for love. Anyway, The love dissolved with startling rapidity, and in half an hour there was little tenderness remaining for the English girl who had repulsed him. He accepted her answer as conclusive, and began at once to revive his former plans of vengeance. One transport was liable to prove as sweet and exciting as another to him, and he began to revel in the consciousness that he was the supreme master of the fate of all the Consinors. Hatatcha was right, after all. These English were cold and faithless, and unworthy the consideration of one of his noble race. He had been incautious and weak for a time, but now he resolved to fulfil his oath to the dead woman to the very letter. He tore the offending paper into fragments, and left the room with a resumption of his old inscrutable demeanour. It was the look that Tadros had learned to fear. "Drive me to the Savoy," he said to his chauffeur. Lord Roane had reserved one small room on the first floor of the hotel as an office, and here he transacted such business matters as came under his jurisdiction. Kara found him unoccupied, and Roane, who knew his visitor but slightly, greeted the man with cordial politeness. "Pray be seated, Prince," said he, offering a chair. "I am entirely at your service." The other bowed coldly. "I fear my mission may prove somewhat disagreeable to you, my lord," he began in quiet, even tones. Roane gave him a shrewd glance. "Ah, I hear that my son is largely indebted to you for losses in gambling," he returned, thinking that he understood Kara's errand. "So far it is merely a rumor that has reached me. But if you come to me to plead that case, I beg to assure you that I am in no way responsible for Consinor's debts of honor." The Egyptian shrugged his shoulders as a Frenchman might have done. "That is another matter, sir, which I do not care to discuss at this time," he answered. "My present business is to obtain your consent to marry your granddaughter." Roane was startled with amazement. "Aneth? You wish to marry Aneth?" he asked, as if he could not have heard aright. "Yes, my lord." So confident was the prince's tone that Lord Roane, although much unnerved by its suddenness, began involuntarily to consider the proposition. The fellow was handsome and dignified, and reputed to be as rich as Croesus, but the Englishman had a natural antipathy to foreigners, especially the dark-skinned ones. The idea of giving Aneth to an Egyptian was revolting. "Ahem! This is indeed a surprise, Prince," he said haltingly. "The child is hardly old enough yet to think of marriage." Kara did not reply to this observation. "Have you approached her with this proposal as yet?" inquired Roane, after a few moments' reflection. "I have, sir." "And what did she say?" "She refused to marry me, giving as her reason the fact that she does not love me," was the calm reply. Roane stared at him. "Then why the devil do you come to me?" he demanded angrily. "Because the girl must not be allowed to choose for herself," said Kara. "Must not, sir?" "Decidedly not, Lord Roane. Too much depends upon her refusal. At present your granddaughter stands disgraced in the eyes of all the world because of that dishonest father, who, as you remarked a moment ago, owes me £10,000. "Aneth disgraced!" cried Roane indignantly. "By no means, sir. Even your vile insinuations cannot injure that pure and innocent girl. But Consinor has gone away, and his daughter is now under my personal protection. I will see that she is accorded the respect and consideration to which she is entitled, despite her father's misdeeds." "Such an assertion, my lord, is under the circumstances ridiculous," replied Kara, with a composure equal to the other's irritation. "In the near future, when you are yourself disgraced and imprisoned, who will then be left to protect your granddaughter's good name?" Roane uttered a roar of exasperation. "You infernal scoundrel!" he exclaimed. "How dare you come here to browbeat and insult me? Leave my presence, sir." "I think you will be glad to hear more," remarked Kara, without changing his position. "Perhaps you are not aware that your robbery of the government through the contractor McFarland is fully known to me." Roane fell back in his chair, white and trembling. "It's a lie," he muttered. "It is not a lie," said the imperturbable Egyptian. "The proofs are all in my hands. I hold your receipt to McFarland for the stolen money." Roane glared at him, but had not a word to reply. He felt like a rat in a trap. From the most unexpected source this blow had fallen upon him when least expected, and already he bitterly regretted his lapse from honesty. "The Egyptian government, when it learns the facts," continued Kara, "will show you no mercy. Even Lord Cromer will insist upon your punishment, for he will resent any embezzlement in office that would bring the English colony here into disrepute. You must be aware of your danger without the necessity of my calling your attention to the fact, so that you have, absolutely, no hope of escape except through my clemency." "What do you mean?" asked the old nobleman hoarsely. "That at present the secret is in my sole possession. It need never be disclosed. Give me Aneth in marriage, and you will not only secure your safety, but I will see that you want for nothing in the future. I am wealthy enough to promise this." "The girl has refused you." "Never mind. You will force her to accept me." "No, by God, I will not!" cried Roane, springing to his feet. "Hell and all its imps shall not induce me to drag that innocent child to my own level. I am a felon because I am an ass, and an ass because I have no moral stamina. But even then my heart is not as black as yours, Prince Kara." The Egyptian listened unmoved. "The matter deserves more careful consideration," said he. "Sentiment is very pretty when it does not conflict with personal safety. An examination of your case reveals comfort and prosperity on the one hand, disgrace and prison on the other." "They weigh nothing against Aneth's happiness," returned the old man promptly. "Expose me as soon as you like, sir, for nothing will ever induce me to save myself from the fruits of my folly at the expense of that poor girl. And now, go!" Kara smiled with quiet scorn. "It is quite refreshing to witness your indignation," said he. "If it were equalled by your honesty, you would have no reason to fear me." "Nor do I fear you now," retorted Lord Roane defiantly. "Do your worst, you infamous nigger, for you cannot bribe me in any way to abet your shameful proposals." Kara reddened at the epithet, but did not reply until he had risen and started to move toward the door. Then he half turned, and said, "It will enable you to appreciate your danger better, Lord Roane, if I tell you that I am but the instrument of an Egyptian woman named Hatatcha, whose life and happiness you once carelessly ruined. She did not forget, and her vengeance against you and yours will be terrible, believe me, unless you engage me to defeat it, instead of accomplishing it. My personal interest induces me to bargain with you. What do you say, my lord? Shall we discuss this subject more fully, or do you wish me to go?" Roane was staring at him with affrighted eyes. 1,000 recollections flashed through his mind at the mention of Hatatcha's name, attended by 1,000 terrors as he remembered his treatment of her. So lost was he in fear and wonder that Kara had to speak again. "Shall I go, my lord?" "Yes," was the answer. It seemed to be wrenched from the old man's throbbing breast by a generosity that conquered his cowardice. Kara frowned. He was disappointed. But further argument was useless, and he went away, leaving Roane fairly stunned by the disclosures of the interview. End of chapter 16. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 17 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. Kara went straight to Annette's apartments, insisting that he must see her. The girl was much distressed by this sudden visit, and, thinking the Egyptian wished merely to renew his protestations and appeals, tried hard to evade the ordeal of an interview. Mrs. Everingham was with her at the time, and in her perplexity Annette confided to her in a few brief words Kara's infatuation, and asked her advice how to act under such trying circumstances. Mrs. Everingham was a woman of strong character and shrewd judgment. She was tall and admirably formed, with undoubted claims to beauty and a carriage queenly and dignified. The wife of a prominent engineer, she had lived much in the Orient and was accustomed to its unconventionalities as well as to its most representative social life. Although so much older than Annette, the lady had manifested a fondness for the lonely girl from their first meeting, and had gladly taken her, as she expressed it, under her wing, as well as to her sympathetic heart, so that Annette had come to rely upon her friend in many ways, and now turned to her in this emergency. "I think it will be best for you to see him," advised Mrs. Everingham after a thoughtful consideration of the case. "If you evade the explanation he doubtless wishes to force upon you, he is the sort of man to annoy you persistently until you grant him an interview. Better have it over at once, and be positive with him, my dear, as well as gentle, so that you leave no hope alive to warrant his renewing his suit." "Won't you stay with me, Lola?" begged Annette. "That would hardly be fair to Prince Kāra," smiled Mrs. Everingham, "for my presence would embarrass and humiliate him unnecessarily. No, I will withdraw into the next room, where I shall be within call, but invisible. Be brave, Annette dear. These disagreeable duties are often thrust upon women who, like yourself, have a faculty of unconsciously winning men's hearts, and are exacted as inevitable penalties. I am sorry for the poor prince, but he is not of our race and had no business to fall in love with an English girl." Then she kissed her protégé and retired to the adjoining room, taking pains to leave the door ajar. Annette sighed and called her Arab to admit Kāra. When the Egyptian entered, his manner in no way indicated the despair of a rejected lover, or even the eagerness of one who hoped to successfully appeal his case. Instead, he bowed coldly, but with profound deference, and said, "You must pardon me, Miss Annette, for forcing this interview upon you, but it was necessary." "Forgive me also, Prince Kāra," faltered the girl. "I am sorry you came, for my answer was final. I can never—" He waved his hand with a gesture of insolent indifference that arrested her words. "You will not be called upon to repeat the dismissal conveyed in your letter," said he. "I may ask you to reverse your decision, but it will be a matter of business between us, in which inclination will have no part." "Sir," she replied, shrinking back from his stern look, I fear I do not understand you." "Be seated," he requested, "and I will explain." She obeyed silently, with a partial recovery of her self-control. Strange as the Egyptian's words proved, they were, after all, more bearable than his endearing protestations would have been, and in her ignorance she welcomed any topic but love. Kāra spoke with brutal frankness. "The scandal caused by your father's dishonesty is too recent for you to have yet escaped its contamination," he began. "Lord Consinor has left Cairo owing me money, a matter of some 10,000 pounds. That you may have no cause to doubt my word, please to examine this note of hand. It is witnessed by 2 respectable gentlemen residing in this city." He handed her the paper, and she took it mechanically, wondering what it meant. "According to our laws," he resumed, "I can bring an action to recover this money against any member of Consinor's family. I am assured this action would ruin Lord Roane completely." She was afraid of him now, but drew herself up proudly. "That will not matter in the least, sir," she replied. "Lord Roane will gladly meet any just obligation, even though it may leave him penniless to do so." "My lord does not express himself quite so honorably as that," replied Kāra with an open sneer. "But this note of hand is really unimportant. I merely mentioned it to emphasize the debt that you and your grandfather already owe me. Your father has cleverly escaped the results of his misdeeds by absconding. Unfortunately, Lord Roane is unable to do the same thing." "No one will blame Lord Roane for his son's faults," she protested, greatly distressed by the cruelty of Kāra's remarks. "That is not my meaning," he replied. "Roane's own misdeeds are so much more serious than those of his son that, when they are discovered, he cannot escape a prison cell." Annette gasped in horror. The accusation was at first beyond belief, but Kāra's tone was positive, and a sudden recollection of her grandfather's doubtful life flashed over her and made her dread to question further. It was not needful. The man continued calmly to enlighten her concerning McFarlane's crime and her grandfather's participation in it, while the girl sat with wide-open eyes and a look of despair upon her white face. Finally, Kāra produced a second paper. "This, Miss Annette," he said more gently, "is the receipt signed by Lord Roane for his share of the stolen money. It is proof positive against him, and you will, of course, recognize his signature. Besides, I can produce 2 witnesses to the crime, a crime for which the penalty is, as I have hinted, a long term of imprisonment as well as dishonor through all the ages to come. But this is only for discovery. There is no penalty exacted for an undiscovered crime. Personally, I do not wish to see Lord Roane disgraced and sent to prison, or your invalid mother impoverished, and you yourself left to the mercies of a reproachful world. So I have come here today to save you from all these consequences of Roane's folly, if you will let me. Annette tried to control her bewilderment. She wanted to think calmly. So vividly had Kara described Lord Roane's offense that she saw it all before her as in a dream, and knew that the old man's feet were stumbling at the edge of a bottomless pit. But the last words of the Egyptian, if she had heard them aright, seemed to promise a chance of her awakening and exorcising the nightmare. "How can you save us?" she asked wearily. "By making you my wife," he answered. "It all rests with you, Miss Annette. I alone can protect Lord Roane from any possibility of discovery, and I will do so if you now promise to marry me. More than that, I will pay off all the mortgages on your grandfather's estates, so that he may live in comfort during the remainder of his life, honored and respected by all. And you shall have your father's note of hand for the 10,000 pounds as soon as I receive your promise, as an earnest of my good faith. And if I refuse," she suggested, trembling, "then you render me powerless to aid and plunge your aged grandfather into prison, disgraced and humiliated beyond any hope of redemption." "No, no, I cannot do that," she wailed miserably. "He has been so good to me and loved me so fondly that I dare not, I will not sacrifice him to secure my own happiness." "It is as I hoped," said Kara, a note of triumph in his voice. "Do you promise, sacredly and on your honor, that you will marry me in return for my shielding your grandfather from the consequences of his crime?" "Yes," she answered, clasping her hands with a shudder. "And will you come to me any day and hour that I may appoint?" "Yes." "Annette, Annette, what have you said? What have you done?" cried Mrs. Everingham, running from her hiding-place to clasp the terrified girl in her arms. "What have I done?" repeated Annette vacantly. "Why, Lola, I saved my dear grandfather from disgrace and ruin." "You shall not keep that promise," declared the woman, turning fiercely to confront Kara. "It was wrung from you by threats, by blackmail, and this scoundrel is playing upon your generous and loving heart. You shall never keep so absurd a promise." "Yes," returned Annette bravely, "I have given my word, and I shall keep it." Kara laid a paper upon the table. "There is your father's note, Miss Annette. You may destroy it." He hesitated an instant, and then added the second paper. "And here is your grandfather's receipt for the stolen money. So fully do I trust to your good faith that I leave the incriminating evidence all in your own hands. Good afternoon, Miss Annette." With a bow, grave and courteous, he passed from the room, and Mrs. Everingham lifted the girl in her strong arms and carried her into the adjoining chamber to lay her tenderly upon her bed. The strain had been severe, and Annette had fainted. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. Finding a Way. Gerald Winston endured several miserable, uneasy days following that of Lord Consinor's public disgrace. He longed to call upon Aneth, but dared not intrude, and so compromised by sending her a daily gift of flowers. At last, however, he decided to see Mrs. Everingham and endeavor to ascertain Aneth's condition, and whether her father's fault was making her as sorrowful as he feared. He found Mrs. Everingham in her rooms in the Savoy, and was admitted at once. "I want to ask you about Miss Consinor," he said, after he had been warmly greeted, for they were good friends, and she was glad he had come. "Aneth is very unhappy," was the sober reply. "I can understand her humiliation, of course," he continued, with a sigh, "although I hoped she would be brave, and not take the unfortunate circumstance too much to heart." "She is young," answered Mrs. Everingham evasively, "and cannot view these things as composedly as we do. Moreover, you must remember that Lord Consinor's trouble touches her more deeply than any one else." "Unless it is the Viscountess," he suggested. "Oh, the poor Viscountess knows nothing of it. She passes her time in an exclusive consideration of her own ailments, and will scarcely see her own daughter at all. Do you know, Gerald, I sometimes wonder how the child can be so sweet and womanly when her surroundings are so dreadful." "I know what you mean," he said. "Consinor has always borne a doubtful reputation at home, and in past years Roane's life has also been more or less disgraceful. But the old fellow seems to be conducting himself very properly since he came to Egypt, and it is possible he has reformed his ways." She did not reply at once, but sat musing until she asked, with startling abruptness, "Gerald, do you love Aneth?" He flushed and stammered in his endeavour to find words to reply. Since his interview with Kāra he had confessed to himself that he did love Aneth, but that another should discover his secret filled the big fellow with confusion. "Why do you ask?" he faltered, to gain time. "Because the girl needs true and loving friends more at this moment than in all her life to come," said she, earnestly. "I will be her true friend in any event," he returned. "But I must know more than that," persisted Mrs. Everingham. "Tell me frankly, Gerald, do you love her?" "Yes." "Well enough to wish to make her your wife in spite of her family's shady history?" "Yes," he said again, looking at her inquiringly. "Then I shall confide to you a great secret, for it is right that you should be apprised of what is going on. And only you, with my assistance to be sure, can hope to defeat the cunning plot that threatens to separate Aneth from you forever." Thereupon she related to him the details of the interview she had overheard between Kāra and the girl, and told of the promise Aneth had made to save her grandfather from disgrace by marrying the Egyptian. "But this is nonsense!" he exclaimed angrily. "The man is a fool to wish to force any woman to marry him, and a scoundrel to use such means to accomplish his purpose." "I know. I have discussed this matter with Aneth long and earnestly, but all in vain. She is determined to sacrifice herself to save Lord Roane from this disgrace, and Prince Kāra is inflexible. For some unknown reason he has determined to make this girl his wife, although he did not talk like a lover, and she told him frankly she could never love or even esteem him. Really, it seems incomprehensible." "I know his reason well enough," answered Winston moodily. "He is acting under the influence of the strongest and most evil human passion, revenge. If you will kindly listen, my friend, I will relate a bit of romance that should enable you to understand the Egyptian's purpose." He proceeded to recount the story of Hatatcha and Lord Roane, adding his grounds for believing that Kāra had from the first contemplated the ruin of the entire Consinor family. "This is horrible!" cried Mrs. Everingham indignantly. "If what you say is true, this native prince is himself a grandson of Roane, and therefore Aneth's cousin." "I have called attention to that fact, and he declares it is no bar to his marrying her. I imagine his real meaning is that the relationship is no bar to his prosecuting his nefarious plans. Does Lord Roane know of this proposed sacrifice of his granddaughter for his sake?" "No, and Aneth has made me promise to keep the secret from him. I cannot see that he would be able to assist us in any way if he knew all that we know." "Perhaps not. Is the story true? Has Roane actually embezzled this money?" "I do not know." "It seems to me," said the young man, thoughtfully, "that our first action should be to discover the truth of Kāra's assertion. He may have trumped up the charge to work upon Aneth's feelings, and lead her to consent to marry him against her will." "That is true," she said. "How can we investigate the matter?" "Very easily. I will go to morrow to the Rosetta barrage and examine the embankment. Afterward I can look up the records and discover what sort of contract this man McFarland had, and how much money he collected for its execution. That will give us the truth of the matter, and I can accomplish it all in 2 days' time." "Then go, but make haste, for every day is precious. We do not know when the prince may call upon Aneth to fulfill her promise." They discussed the situation a while longer, and then Winston withdrew to prepare for taking the early morning train. The second evening after, he again called upon Mrs. Everingham. "Well," she inquired eagerly, "what did you discover?" "It is all true," he answered despondently. "The swindle has been very cleverly consummated, and in just the way Kāra explained it to Aneth. There is no doubt of Lord Roane's guilt, neither can we doubt that Kāra has both the power and the will to expose and imprison him if it suits his purpose to do so." "Then," said Mrs. Everingham, firmly, "we must find another way to save Aneth. The poor child is heartbroken, and moans every moment that she is left alone with her misery. Lord Roane tries earnestly to comfort her, for I am sure he loves her as well as one of his character is capable of loving. But he imagines she grieves over her father, and does not suspect the truth." "Is she still resolved upon keeping her promise?" he inquired. "Yes, and that in spite of all I can say to move her. The girl has a gentle and loving nature, but underneath it is a will of iron and a stubbornness such as the early martyrs must have possessed. She holds her own happiness as nothing when compared with her grandfather's safety." "Then what can we do?" he asked, pacing the floor nervously. "We must resort to a cunning equal to Kāra's in order to induce Aneth to break her foolish promise," responded Mrs. Everingham promptly. "I fear I do not quite understand," he said, stopping before her to read her countenance for the clue. "I think, nay, Gerald, I am certain, the girl loves you, for I have questioned her skilfully during your absence and led her to speak of you, watching her tell-tale eyes as she did so. In my opinion, it is this secret love for another that makes her sacrifice so grievous, and will end in breaking her heart." He blushed like a girl at hearing this, but was evidently reassured and delighted. "Yet I do not understand even now, Mrs. Everingham," he said. "It is not so much that you are as stupid as that you are a man," she answered, smiling. "You must become the instrument to save Aneth from herself. In a few moments I shall take you to see her. Her rooms are just across the hall, and doubtless she is at this moment alone, Lord Roane having left the hotel an hour ago. This evening I will give you countenance, but thereafter you must play your own game, and do your utmost to draw from Aneth a confession that she loves you. When you have done that, our case is won." "Why so?" "Can't you see, Gerald? No right-minded girl would ruin the life of the man she loves to save her grandfather from the consequences of his own errors. If she is in the mood to sacrifice, we will let her sacrifice Lord Roane instead of herself or you." "Oh," he said blankly, "I can't do that, you know, Mrs. Everingham." "Why not?" "It would not be honest or fair, and it would be selfish in me and unmanly." "But I am not thinking of you at all, sir, except as the instrument. I am thinking of Aneth and her life's happiness. Are you willing, on your part, to sacrifice her to such a man as Kāra, that he might crush her to gratify his revenge?" "No, but—" "Will you permit her, in her blindness and folly, to break her own heart and ruin her own life, when you know that you can save her?" "No." "The struggle is between you and Kāra. Lord Roane is a felon, and to save him from the penalty due his acts will be to merely postpone the day when another of his criminal misdeeds will be discovered. There is little possible redemption for a man who has attained his sinful years, but if the possibility did exist, the price would be too high. Opposed to the desirability of shielding this reprobate nobleman and giving Kāra his way, which simply means Aneth's ruin, we must consider your mutual love and the prospect of a long life of happiness for you both. Do you dare to hesitate, Gerald Winston?" "I will do exactly as you say, Mrs. Everingham," he replied impetuously. "I can't let her go to this fiend, to the terrible fate that awaits her. Tell me what to do, and I will obey." "Your first duty will be to come with me to her room. And drop that long face, sir. Be cheery and light-hearted, and woo Aneth as tenderly as if you were wholly ignorant of the dreadful position she is in. Arrange to call again to-morrow, and in the future do not leave her alone for a single evening, and haunt her at all hours of the day. Remember that time is precious, and the situation demands all your skill and diplomacy. It cannot be a long siege. You must determine to capture her by attack." "I'll try," he said nervously. And so he met Aneth again, for the first time since her trouble had come upon her, and he performed his part so creditably that Mrs. Everingham had but little fault to find with her coadjutor. The sight of the girl's swollen eyelids and her sad and resigned expression of countenance so aroused his loving pity and indignation at the cruel plot that had enmeshed her, that he could scarcely restrain the impulse to declare at once his love and entreat her to give him an immediate right to protect her. Perhaps Aneth read something of his love for her in his eager face, for she joined with Mrs. Everingham in sustaining the flow of small talk that was likely to prove her best safeguard, and in this way was led to forget for the moment her cares and fears. She hesitated a moment when Gerald proposed to bring her a new book next afternoon, but finally consented. Therefore he left her feeling more buoyant and hopeful than he had thought could be possible a few short hours before. From that evening his former shyness disappeared, and he pushed his suit with as much ardor as he dared, utterly ignoring Aneth's evident desire to restrain him from speaking too plainly. But sometimes she, too, forgot her impending fate, and gave way to the delight of these happy moments. Already she knew that Gerald loved her, for her woman's instinct was alert, and at night she lay upon her bed and wailed miserably because the gates of paradise had suddenly opened before her, and her willing feet were so bound that she might not enter. During these days Lord Roane devoted much of his time to his grandchild, treating her with almost reverential tenderness, and striving in every possible way to cheer her spirits. The old man realized that his probation might be short. At any moment Kāra was liable to fulfill his threat and expose him to the authorities, and involuntarily he caught himself listening at all times for the footfall of the official coming to arrest him. He even wondered why he had escaped so long, knowing nothing of the manner in which Aneth had saved him. And the girl, noting his loving care for her and marking the trouble that often clouded his handsome face, was encouraged in her resolve to carry out her compact with Kāra rather than see her aged grandfather thrust into prison, humiliated and disgraced. Between her awakening love for Gerald Winston and her desire to save the family honor, the girl was indeed in pitiable straits. Yet never for a moment did she hesitate as to which way the path of duty led. She felt that every day she remained unmolested by the Egyptian was a precious boon to be grateful for, yet always she dreaded Kāra's summons. However, he was in no hurry, realizing the bitterness to her of these days of waiting, and enjoying the prolongation of her sufferings. All the love that Kāra had formerly borne the girl seemed to have dissolved as if by magic, and in its place had grown up schemes for so horrible a vengeance that he often wondered whether Hatatcha herself might not have hesitated to accomplish it. But Kāra did not hesitate. The very diablerie of the thing fascinated and delighted him, and he anticipated the event with eager joy. Tadros spent much of his time at the hotel in charge of Kāra's elaborate system of espionage. His functions as dragoman gained for him special privileges, and the hall porter allowed him free access to the lobby, yet he was only able to enter the upper halls when he could plead some definite errand. This excuse was provided by a guest of the hotel, an agreeable Frenchman who was in Kāra's employ and maintained a surveillance over the interior of the establishment, while a half-dozen Arabs and Copts watched carefully the exterior. Thus Tadros was enabled to keep in close touch with the movements of Lord Roane and Aneth, as well as to spy upon those who might visit them, and his orders were to report promptly to Kāra any suspicious circumstances which might indicate that his victims were planning their escape. But from the dragoman's reports all seemed well, and his prospective prey apparently made no effort to evade their fate. Kāra depended much upon Aneth's delicate sense of honor and her strength of character, and read her so truly that there was little chance of her disappointing him. Roane, however, caused him a little uneasiness, and the Egyptian's spies shadowed him wherever he went. But Kāra misjudged the old gentleman if he supposed that Roane would tamely submit to Aneth's sacrifice had he known her secret. The girl understood him better, and although she did not know of his indignant rejection of Kāra's offer to shield him at the expense of his granddaughter's happiness, Aneth knew that if Roane learned the truth he would at once give himself up to justice in order to save her, and here was a danger the clever Egyptian had not even suspected. In many of his dealings Roane was doubtless an unprincipled knave, but certain points of character were so impressed upon his nature, through inheritance from generations of more noble consignors, that in matters of chivalry his honor could not be successfully challenged. The dragoman said nothing to Kāra about Winston's frequent visits to Aneth. During his hours of watching, Tadros involved in reflection, and these musings encouraged a growing resentment toward his master that destroyed much of his value as a confidential servant. Aside from the resentment, Tadros was afraid of Kāra, and also uneasy as to his financial condition. The prince, who was accustomed to scatter money with a liberal hand, had of late refrained from exhibiting a single piastre. Tadros wondered and grew suspicious. One evening, as he reported to Kāra, he said, "The tradesmen are clamoring for their money. They say you are not paying them as promptly as you did heretofore." Kāra looked up with surprise. "Is not my credit good?" he inquired. "For the present, yes," replied the dragoman, "but it will not remain good unless you begin to pay for all the magnificence you are putting into this villa." "I see," said Kāra, nodding thoughtfully. "They are fools, my Tadros, but they might become troublesome. Keep them satisfied with promises for a time longer. That should not be a difficult task." Tadros looked at him distrustfully. "Tell me, my prince, have you spent all your treasure?" he asked. The Egyptian smiled. "If I should live 1,000 years, my Tadros," he returned, "I could not spend the half of it." "Then why do you not pay these merchants?" "Because I have at this time no more money in the bank, and it is not convenient for me to leave Cairo just now to secure a further supply." "Oh, I see," remarked the dragoman, heaving a sigh of relief. "You must make another trip to Fedah." Kāra gave him one of those intent, thoughtful looks that always made Tadros uneasy, but when he spoke his voice sounded soft and pleasant. "What causes you to think my treasure is at Fedah, my good friend?" he asked. The tone reassured the dragoman. "It stands to reason, my prince, that it is there," he answered with frank indifference. "Do I not well remember first seeing the papyri in your house, and afterward carrying away from there the heavy traveling case that was filled with the precious gems?" "Ah, was it?" "Of course, Kāra. How else could you give so many ancient gems to the Vanderveens to recut, or turn so many more into money by selling them to Andalaft the jeweler?" "You have been observant, my Tadros." "It is natural. I am no fool; but if, as you say, there is more treasure at Fedah, I will undertake to keep the rascally tradesmen quiet until you can make another deposit in the bank." Kāra was still reading the countenance of his dragoman. "It is quite evident that you are no fool, my Tadros," he said softly. "Yet I had not imagined you capable of so much shrewdness and wisdom. Look you, Fedah consists of a rock and a few stone houses cemented with Nile mud. It is familiar to you, being your birthplace as well as my own. Now, where do you suppose, within the limits of that simple village, a treasure could have been discovered?" "It has puzzled me," acknowledged Tadros, "but I suppose you do not wish me to know the exact location. Nevertheless, it is evident that the treasure is a very ancient one, and therefore it must have been hidden by your forefathers in the mountain itself, or perhaps on the desert that adjoins the village." "A long buried and forgotten temple, eh, Tadros?" "Oh, no, a tomb, of course. They did not keep pearls and rubies in the temples; only in tombs could such trinkets be found. That is why I believe your statement that you are the last descendant of the great kings of Egypt, for this tomb was not discovered by accident, I know. The secret of its existence must have been handed down through the generations. Hatatcha knew of it and told you of it before she died, so it is your personal property, and its possession proves your noble blood. I am glad the treasure is ample, for at the rate you are squandering money, it would otherwise soon be exhausted." "Very wisely argued indeed," said Kāra. "I wonder how much of my inheritance has already found its way into your own pockets?" "Not too much, you may be sure," answered the dragoman gravely. "I am very honest, and take only my rightful perquisites. It is better that these trifles should go to me than to strangers, for I am your own kinsman, and almost as pure an Egyptian as yourself." "True. I do not complain, my Tadros, but in acquiring my money you should take care not to acquire too much knowledge of my affairs with it, for such knowledge is liable to prove extremely dangerous. Consider the pearls of wisdom that have even now dropped from your lips. Must they not be repaid? And already I am greatly in your debt." "You are talking riddles," growled the dragoman uneasily. "Tell me what you mean in plain words." "Do you remember the day that Nephthys broke her water jar?" "Yes." "You struck me, your prince, and knocked me down." "Well, you choked me afterward. That should even the score." "Not quite. I choked you for spying upon me. That was another offence. The blow has not yet been accounted for." Tadros frowned. "I do not bear grudges myself," he muttered. "There are a few other matters scored against your account," continued Kāra. "Still, so long as you serve me faithfully, and I have need of you, I shall not exact a reckoning. But they stand on record, my Tadros, and some day the account must be balanced. Do not forget that. For these reasons, and remembering that you have declared yourself no fool, I am certain that you will admit you were wrong about the location of my treasure. When you think it over, you will conclude that it lies in Luxor or Abydos, or perhaps is a myth altogether and never has existed. And when you chatter to others, no mention of a hidden tomb or temple will be permitted to pass your lips. I am quite sure you will be circumspect, and I trust you to keep to yourself the secret of my affairs. If I thought you would betray me, I would kill you now instead of waiting. But you will not do that. You are too fond of living and of the money you are saving to hazard losing both." Tadros returned to his duties in a very thoughtful mood. In playing upon his fears, Kāra had overreached himself and made the dragoman so much afraid that he believed his life hung by a thread. Therefore he sought most earnestly for a way of escape from the thrall of his terrible countrymen. The following morning Gerald Winston, on leaving Mrs. Everingham after a conference concerning their plans, met Tadros face to face in the corridor of the hotel. He recognized the man at once as Kāra's dragoman and confidential servant. Moreover, he suspected that the fellow had just come from the Consinor apartments, so he had no hesitation in accosting him. "May I speak with you a moment in private?" he asked. "Most certainly, sir." Winston led the way into Mrs. Everingham's drawing room, where the lady greeted his return with surprise, but a quick appreciation of the importance of securing an interview with Kāra's confidant. "You are Prince Kāra's dragoman, I believe?" began the Englishman. "Yes, Winston Bey." "And devoted to him personally, of course?" "To an extent, naturally," returned Tadros, hesitating what to say. "You see, he pays me liberally." Winston and Mrs. Everingham exchanged glances. Then the lady took up the conversation. "Prince Kāra," she said in a stern tone, "is a scoundrel, being even now engaged in perfecting one of the most diabolical plots the mind of man has ever conceived." Tadros did not reply. It was not his business to deny the charge. "Our desire and intention to defeat this plot," she continued, "lead us to speak with you frankly. We must save Miss Consinor from an ignoble alliance with your master." Tadros listened carefully. "To accomplish our purpose, we are willing to expend a great deal of money, enough to make some faithful ally comfortable for the remainder of his life." A pause followed this significant statement. Tadros felt the effect of their scrutinizing glances, and cleared his throat while he looked swiftly around to make sure they could not be overheard. Then, reassured, he answered with his native bluntness of speech. "I am willing to earn this money," said he, "if you will show me how to do it with safety. Kāra is a fiend. He would not hesitate to kill all three of us if he had reason to suspect we were plotting against him." "I will give you £1,000," said Winston, "if you will tell us what you know of Kāra's plan. I will give you £2,000 additional if we succeed in saving Miss Consinor." Tadros was pleased. He had intended to break with Kāra anyway. To be well paid for doing this was a stroke of good fortune. "I accept your offer," he replied, "but I must inform you that there is no time to be lost. I have just taken a message to Miss Consinor, telling her to be ready to go to Kāra at 9 o'clock this evening." "This evening!" exclaimed Winston, alarmed. "And what was her reply?" She assured me that she would keep her compact with the prince and be ready to accompany me at the hour named. I am to call for her and take her in a closed carriage to Kāra's villa." "And then?" asked Mrs. Everingham, eagerly. "Then there is to be a mock ceremony of marriage, which is intended to entrap the young lady so that she will think everything is regular and will make no disturbance," answered Tadros, calmly. "A Copt named Michael, who is one of Kāra's servants, is to be dressed as a priest, and perform the Coptic marriage service, which is a Christian function not unlike your own. But the man is not a priest, and the marriage will be illegal. The intention is to destroy the young lady's good name, after which Kāra will drive her away. Then he intends to deliver her grandfather, Lord Roane, over to justice." "What a dreadful crime!" exclaimed Mrs. Everingham, indignantly. "And Aneth is sacrificing herself because she believes the act will save her grandfather." "That is Kāra's promise," returned the dragoman, "but he has no intention of keeping it. Did he not give her a forged copy of Roane's receipt? For some reason my prince aims at the ruin of the entire Consinor family. The young lady's father he has already disgraced and driven from Cairo." "I understand his motive," said Winston, "and believe you are right in claiming that Kāra will not spare Lord Roane once Aneth is in his power. The danger is terrible and imminent, for nothing will move Aneth to abandon her purpose. She imagines she is saving Roane, and has exacted from us a promise not to tell the old gentleman of her sacrifice. So our hands are tied." "It seems to me," declared Mrs. Everingham, after a moment's thought, "that we must use the self same weapons in fighting Kāra that he is employing. With the dragoman's assistance it ought to be easy to save Aneth even against her will." "In what way?" inquired Gerald, earnestly. She did not reply at once. Instead, she studied the dragoman's countenance with steadfast eyes. "What is your name?" she asked. "Tadros, madam." "Will you follow our instructions faithfully, and not betray us to Prince Kāra?" "Yes. I hate Kāra. He will kill me for deserting him if he gets the chance, but then he intends to kill me anyway as soon as he can spare my services. If your plan includes the murder of Prince Kāra, I shall be very glad." "It does not, but we will protect you from any harm, rest assured. Your task is simple. When you call for Miss Consinor tonight, you will drive her, not to the prince's villa, but to the embankment, where you will place her on board Winston Bey's dahabeah. It will lie opposite Roda on the west bank. Cross the Gezira bridge and drive as rapidly as possible to the boat, where we shall be waiting to receive you." "My dahabeah!" cried Winston, astonished. "To be sure. You will have everything in readiness for a voyage up the Nile, with a prisoner aboard." "A prisoner?" "Yes, Aneth. She will of course refuse to go willingly, having given Kāra her word. I will accompany the party as her keeper, and we must find some way to induce Lord Roane to join us also. Once afloat on the mysterious river, Kāra will have no means of knowing what has become of his victims, and before we return, my friend, we shall have perfected such arrangements as will render the prince's intention to marry our Aneth impossible. That is why I desire Lord Roane to join the party. He will also be safe from Kāra for a time." "I understand you now," said Winston, "and while I do not see quite to the end of the adventure, the plan will at least give us some time to formulate our future action and enable us to thwart Kāra's immediate schemes." "That is my idea," she returned. "Something must be done at once, and by abducting Aneth we gain not only time, but save her temporarily from the consequences of her own folly." Then she turned to Tadros. "What do you think of my plan?" she asked. "It is excellent," said he, "except for one thing. There are several spies about this hotel, who would at once follow us and inform Kāra that we had boarded the dahabeah, but I think I can find a way to throw them off the scent. They are under my orders, and I will send them to other stations before 9 o'clock. Aside from this, then, do I understand that my only duty is to deliver the young lady on board the dahabeah?" "That is all we ask." "I will show 3 red lights," said Winston, "so that you cannot mistake the exact location of the boat." "I know the boat," replied the dragoman. "Abdallah, your engineer, is a friend of mine." "You will not fail us?" asked Mrs. Everingham, anxiously. "All depends on you, Tadros." "I know, and I will not fail you," he said. "I believe you will earn the £3,000," remarked Winston, significantly. "As for that, sir," replied the dragoman with dignity. "I hope you will give me credit for a little humanity as well as cupidity. Being an Egyptian, I love money. Being a man, I am eager to assist a woman in distress. But above all else, I shall have pleasure in defying Kāra, who hates me as heartily as I hate him. Thus, three passions vouch for my fidelity: love, pity, and hatred. Can you doubt my devotion to the cause?" After this he went away, leaving his fellow conspirators to plan the details of the evening's adventure. End of chapter 18.
Chapter number 19 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson. Chapter 19. The Abduction. Mrs. Everingham passed the afternoon in Aneth's company. The girl was visibly nervous and excited, but made pitiful attempts to conceal her weakness. In no way did she allude to Kāra or to the fact that the hour had arrived when she was to consummate the sacrifice of her own happiness to maintain her grandfather's integrity and the honour of her family's name. Her friend ventured one or two remarks about the folly of her promise and the absurdity of keeping it. But these so distressed Aneth and had so little visible influence upon her decision that Mrs. Everingham abandoned the topic and turned the conversation into more cheerful channels. When she mentioned Gerald Winston, she noticed that Aneth's cheeks flamed scarlet and then turned deathly white. So here was another subject to be avoided, if she did not wish to make the girl's position unbearable. Indeed, those last days of association with Gerald had taught Aneth the full extent of her martyrdom, and now she began to realize that she was losing all that might have rendered her life's happiness complete, had it not been for the advent of Kāra and his terrible threat to destroy the family honor and send her loving grandfather to prison. Early in the evening, Mrs. Everingham kissed her friend and returned to her own room across the corridor, there to complete her simple preparations for the proposed voyage. Meantime, Winston had been busy with Lord Rohan. The young man was fortunately a prime favourite with Aneth's grandsire, and he listened attentively to Gerald's explanation of a plot to rescue his darling grandchild from the slough of despondency into which she had fallen. Mrs. Everingham is confident a Nile voyage would do much to cheer her up and keep her from dwelling upon her troubles, he suggested. What do you think of the idea, sir? Capital, said Rohan, if Aneth can be induced to consent. I asked her to run over to Helwan the other day for a few weeks' change of scene, but she declared she would not listen to such a proposal. That is our difficulty, acknowledged Winston, speaking in a confidential tone. She has told Mrs. Everingham she would not leave Cairo, but we think her decision is based upon the fear that you would be unable to accompany her. So we have decided to engage in a little conspiracy. For the morbid condition into which she has fallen has made us all anxious. Is there any reason, my lord, why you should not leave Cairo for a month or so? None whatever, if my going will benefit Aneth in any way. Very good. Now here is our plan. I fitted my private dahabeeyah for a cruise. Mrs. Everingham will go along to chaperone your granddaughter, and you will join us to complete her happiness and keep her contented. Only one thing stands in our way, the young lady's refusal to embark. That barrier will be surmounted by Mrs. Everingham, who is a woman of experience and who loves Aneth as well as if she were her own daughter. So this evening you and I will get aboard quietly without declaring our intentions to anyone and rely upon Mrs. Everingham's promise to join us with Aneth at 9 o'clock. Do not ask me, sir, how she will succeed in overcoming your granddaughter's scruples against leaving Cairo. We will trust the woman's wit. When the party is embarked, we will go up the Nile to find roses for your grandchild's pale cheeks and have a jolly good time as well." Rowan accepted the programme with enthusiasm. He himself was in a dreadfully nervous state, expecting hourly to be accused of a crime, the proof of which would separate him forever from Aneth. To get away from Cairo just now, without Kāra's knowing where he had gone, would be to gain a few weeks' respite. Eagerly he availed himself of the opportunity. Winston knew there was no danger of the old man's betraying their plans, but he could not divine what Kāra's next move might be, and resolved to take no chances. So he clung fast to Rowan until he had put him and his light luggage aboard the dahabijah, whereupon he sent a message to apprise Mrs. Everingham of his success. So far all had gone well, but Mrs. Everingham's anxiety grew as the hour of 9 approached. Lord Rowan had sent word to Aneth that he would be out for dinner and might not return to the hotel until late that night. So the girl, glad of this fortunate chance, had her dinner served in her own room, and the Arab servant, being intercepted by Mrs. Everingham, declared that she ate little and wept continually, as if overcome by some hopeless sorrow. All depended now upon the faithfulness of Tadros, the dragoman, and Mrs. Everingham, finding nothing more for her woman's ingenuity to devise, entered a carriage at 8:30 and was driven quietly to the embankment. Within sight of the 3 red lights Winston had displayed, she halted her vehicle to await the arrival of the dragoman. Tadros, meantime, being fully instructed by Kāra as to the conduct of his mission, drove in the Egyptian's private carriage to the hotel. The coachman had been instructed to obey the dragoman's orders implicitly, so he suspected nothing when Tadros, having alighted at the Savoy, commanded him to drive to the citadel and remain in the shadow of the mosque until midnight. The dragoman then hired another carriage that was driven by a sleepy and stupid-looking Arab, after which he immediately entered the hotel and went directly to Aneth's room. She opened the door in person, having dismissed all her attendants. "It is 9 o'clock, miss," announced Tadros as he entered. The girl clasped her hands with a gesture and look of terror. "Where is Prince Kāra?" she asked vaguely. "At his villa, awaiting with the bridal party your arrival. You must understand that the wedding is to be very quietly conducted, yet strictly in accordance with the requirements of the Christian faith. My master desires me to say that every consideration and courtesy shall be shown you, his highest ambition in the future being to promote your happiness." She shuddered. "Is that all he said?" "Except that his promises to you shall be faithfully kept, and Lord Rowan's comfort and safety carefully provided for." "Let us go," she said hastily. "I am ready." "Any luggage, miss?" he asked. She pointed to a small travelling case that stood beside her, and Tadros stooped and picked it up. With a frightened glance around her, she placed a note directed to Lord Rowan upon the table and then hurriedly left the room, leaving the door unlocked. The dragoman escorted her to the side entrance, reserved for ladies, and they were fortunate in finding it almost deserted at that moment. Aneth entered the carriage quickly, as if fearful of being interrupted in her escape, and Tadros closed the door and took his seat beside the driver. "To the Opera House," he said, for the benefit of the few loungers who stood upon the pavement. After driving a couple of blocks, he made the Arab driver stop in front of a tobacco shop and sent him in to purchase some cigarettes. The moment the fellow disappeared, Tadros started the horses and applied the whip, and the carriage had whirled swiftly around the corner before the wandering Arab returned to the street to find his equipage and his passengers missing. Aneth, as soon as she had leaned back against the cushions, had fallen into a sort of stupor. Her weary brain refused to think or to speculate upon the doubtful fate to which she was rushing. She felt the carriage bumping over the crossings and saw vaguely the lights flash by, but she noted neither the direction in which they were proceeding nor the length of their journey. Across the Nile bridge the horses abated their speed, but then through the darker lanes of the west embankment they dashed along at a wild pace that might have frightened the girl had she been capable of realizing the actual conditions. Suddenly, with a jolt that almost threw her into the opposite seat, the carriage halted. She looked out of the window and saw 3 dim red lights burning, and beyond these the glint of a stray moonbeam upon the river. When Tadros came to assist her in alighting, she saw Mrs. Everingham standing behind him. "Where am I?" asked the girl wildly. "Hush, dear," said her friend, taking her in her arms to kiss her tenderly. "Am I not welcome at your wedding?" "But why are we here?" asked Aneth pleadingly. "Why are we at the river, and where is Prince Kāra?" "Come and let me surprise you," answered Mrs. Everingham soothingly, leading the young girl, who was still half dazed and thoroughly mystified, aboard the dahabeeyah and into the brightly lighted little cabin. There sat Lord Rohan and Gerald Winston. Aneth stared, and then, looking wildly around, she gave a plaintive cry and threw herself into her grandfather's arms. "I don't understand," she wailed, sobbing hysterically. "What does it all mean? Why are you here, and where is Prince Kāra?" Rohan was puzzled by her speech as well as distressed by her agitation. "Prince Kāra," he repeated. "Confound it, Aneth, you don't want that rascally nigger, do you?" "No, no," she replied, "but he wants me, and I have promised. I must go to him. Why am I here? What have you done?" By this time the dragoman had tied his horses to a palm and come aboard, just as Hassan drew in the gangplank and Abdallah started the wheezy engine. Tadros stood in the cabin doorway and listened intently to Aneth's protests. "See here, miss," he exclaimed with assumed sternness. "You are in my charge, for I am Prince Kāra's dragoman, and you have promised to obey me. Is it not so?" She turned to look at him. "Are you obeying Prince Kāra's orders?" she demanded. "To be sure. He wished to surprise you. He says he merely intended to test your honesty, being interested in knowing whether an English girl would keep her promises. But he does not desire to make you unhappy. He is a prince and generous, therefore he releases you from your compact, and you are free from this time forth to do exactly as you please." She was white and trembling now. "But my grandfather," she began eagerly. Tadros cut her short. "He also is safe, in proof of which you see him at your side. You need have no fears in the future that—" He stopped abruptly, for the overwrought nerves of the girl could not withstand this sudden revulsion of fate. Gerald caught her swaying form and carried her to her berth, where Mrs. Everingham tended her lovingly and applied restoratives to relieve her faintness. As for Lord Rohan, he swore loudly and glared upon the dragoman. "What cursed nonsense is this?" he cried. Tadros smiled, and Gerald came up and seized the dragoman by both hands, pressing them warmly. "Thank you, my man," said he. "You are a loyal ally, and I shall not forget how you have lied to save us from an embarrassing position." Then he turned to Lord Rohan. "If there is anything your lordship does not understand," he said, "I will gladly endeavour to explain it. Prince Kāra has been playing a deep game with you and Aneth as pawns, but I think we have him checkmated at last." The old nobleman did not reply at once. Any questioning on his part would necessarily be a very delicate matter. He turned his eyes thoughtfully towards the shore, where the lights of Cairo were slowly disappearing from their view. End of chapter 19. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London.
Chapter 20 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 20. The Sheikh agrees. Kāra congratulated himself. For one whose early life had been passed in a hovel, he had been very successful in directing the destinies of the great. All his grandmother's vengeful plans, supplemented by his own clever arrangement of details, had matured in a remarkably satisfactory manner, and this evening he was destined to complete the ruin of Lord Roane's family. In addition to compromising Aneth beyond all hope by a false marriage, he would tomorrow have my lord cast into prison on a charge of embezzlement. The proof which he had pretended to place in the girl's keeping, and which she had without doubt promptly destroyed, was merely a forgery of the receipt to MacFarland. The original was still safe in his custody. The ruse had been a clever one. His judgment of the girl's nature was marvellously accurate. Having destroyed the paper to ensure her grandfather's safety, Aneth was effectually prevented from breaking her contract with Kāra. There was no way for her to recede. He had paid the price, and she was left with no excuse for not fulfilling her part of the agreement. When Kāra entered his courtyard, he found it ablaze with lights. The women's apartments, now completely refitted, were truly magnificent. A dozen servants, arrayed in splendid costumes, stood motionless at their posts, awaiting the arrival of their new mistress. Michael, a rascally Copt whom Kāra had recently attached to his household, was clad in priestly robes, and paced up and down the court with an assumed dignity that elicited sly smiles from his fellow servants. Only the prince's own people were present, for Kāra wished to be in a position to deny even the farce of a ceremony, should Aneth attempt in the future to use it as an excuse for her downfall. But it pleased him to lull her suspicions in this way in the beginning, and so render her an easy victim. It also gave an added flavour to his revenge. Tadros had been carefully instructed, and would have no difficulty in fulfilling his mission. He ought to reach the villa on his return by 9:30, allowing for natural delays. Kāra trusted Tadros because the dragoman was completely in his power, but, with his usual caution, he had sent a spy to watch his messenger and report any irregularity in his conduct. Tadros did not know of this spy, otherwise he might have felt less confidence in himself. 9:30 arrived, and no sound of carriage wheels broke the stillness. The servants stood motionless in their places, and Kāra paced the courtyard in deep reflection, while engaged in drawing on his white kid gloves. The false priest stood under the bower of roses, where the ceremony was to take place, trying to find the service in the Coptic Bible he had borrowed. 9:45. 10 o'clock. The dark-eyed servants noticed that their master grew uneasy, and cast anxious glances towards the entrance. It was 20 minutes later, when the nerves of the most unconcerned were beginning to get on edge, that the patter of horses' feet and the rapid whir of wheels broke the silence. A carriage dashed up to the villa and halted. Kāra hurried forward expectantly, but paused abruptly when he met the spy who had been sent to watch Tadros. "Where is the dragoman?" he demanded in a sharp voice. "The dragoman, your highness, is a traitor," said the man. Kāra's nervousness suddenly subsided. He became composed in demeanour, and his voice grew soft. "Explain, if you please," said he. The man bowed. "Arriving at his hotel, Tadros sent away your Excellency's carriage. Where is it now?" "I do not know. Then he engaged another equipage, that of the Arab named Efter Marada, bearing the number of 93. Tadros brought the young lady down and placed her in Efter's carriage, ordering him to drive to the opera house. I sprang up behind and accompanied them. Tadros soon got rid of Efter by sending him on an errand, and then drove quickly away. He crossed the Nile to the west embankment and drove down the river to a point opposite the island of Rhoda, where your dragoman placed the lady on board a dahabeah." "Yes, go on." "When the boat steamed away up the river, I took the deserted carriage and drove here as rapidly as possible. That is all, your Excellency." "Whose dahabeah was it?" that belonging to Winston Bey. I saw him on board." "Did you see anyone else?" "The lady who has been a friend to Miss Consinor. That is Mrs. Everingham. And an old Englishman, Lord Roane." "Ah, quite a family party. And our dear Tadros went with them?" "He did, your Excellency." "Up the river, you say?" "Yes, your Excellency." "Thank you. You may retire." Kāra turned to Ebbek. "Put out the lights and send the servants to their quarters," he said calmly. In his room the prince tore off the white gloves and changed from evening dress to a grey travelling suit. Then he returned to the now deserted courtyard and sat down in the moonlight beside the fountain to smoke a cigar. The blow had been sharp and sudden. While Kāra fully realized the natural capability of Tadros for deception and double-dealing, he also knew that the blustering dragoman was an arrant coward, and so was bewildered at the courage manifested in his treachery. But it was characteristic of Kāra that he neither bemoaned his adverse fortune nor became despondent. He entertained a passing regret that he had delayed killing the dragoman, but did not permit himself to dwell long upon his servant's defection. The thing to be first sought was a remedy for the apparent failure of his carefully laid plans. By and by he would attend to the dragoman's reward. Just now it was imperative to prevent his intended victims from succeeding in their attempt to escape. There was no demand for immediate action. The dahabeah was, as he knew, a slow steamer, and would be forced to breast the Nile current sluggishly. His enemies doubtless depended for their safety from pursuit upon Kāra's supposed ignorance of their whereabouts. He admitted that someone had plotted shrewdly against him. On the Nile, a party in a small boat is almost as isolated as if at sea. The express steamers and tourist steamers pass now and then, but they travel rapidly, appearing and disappearing within the brief space of half an hour. Aside from these, only the native barges, picturesque and ghost-like as they drift by, break the ripples of the broad river. The banks are sprinkled with many villages, and at this season shadoof workers are plentiful. But the native has tired of staring at the Nile flotilla, unless waiting with eagerness the landing of the big tourist steamer, from whose passengers a scant livelihood is gained, and this occurs only at certain points of interest. So Kāra had time to deliberate. It even occurred to him that this seeming calamity might turn out to be exceptionally favorable to the success of his schemes. In Cairo one must act with circumspection, because the police of the city are alert and almost incorruptible. The Nile dwellers fear the law rather than respect it, but they are too far from the capital to be very much afraid. Where tourists disembark, a mounted officer is stationed to lash the imprudent villagers into a state of dull apathy, such as the caged tiger feels for its trainer. But they lapse into savagery when his back is turned, and in the more unfrequented villages the sheikh is absolute king. Kāra considered carefully these conditions, and soon formed new plans to complete his vengeance. Then, the cigar being finished, he went to bed and slept until daybreak. "I shall be absent for several days," he said to Ebbek, as he ate an early breakfast. "See that everything is in perfect order when I return. If tradesmen come to demand money, promise them payment immediately on my arrival in Cairo." "Yes, my master." He caught the morning train for Luxor, and arrived by noon at a station opposite the native village of Beni Hassan, whence he crossed the river in a small boat. The children of Hassan have for centuries been known as the bandits of the Nile, and their 3 connected villages, lying close to the river bank, have replaced those that were totally destroyed by the government during the reign of Muhammad Ali, in the hope of scattering the tribes and breaking up their thieving propensities. But the Beni Hassans rebuilt their mud dwellings and calmly remained in possession. Today they are cautiously avoided by isolated tourists who are fully warned of their evil reputation. As he landed, Kāra found the villages seemingly deserted. Underneath the tall palms at the right, a few swathed figures lay motionless, while small black goats and stray chickens wandered listlessly about. But the visitor paid little attention to these signs. He knew the old men and women were swarming in the huts, while the younger men were away at the distant tombs in the hills, or engaged in earning a stipend at the neighboring shadoofs. Turning to the left, he followed a path leading up a slight incline to a low bluff covered with a second grove of stately palms, beneath the shade of which the better dwellings of Beni Hassan have been built. He had never been in the village before, but had heard it described innumerable times since his boyhood. Even when he paused before an extensive building having cane and mud walls and a roof of palm leaves, he was fairly certain he had correctly guessed the location of the place he sought. "Does Sheik Antar live here?" he asked a child that came out to stare at him. The little one nodded and ran within. Kāra sat down cross-legged upon the path of baked mud, removed both his shoes and placed them beside him, and then patiently awaited his reception. After some 5 minutes, a gigantic Arab bent his head to emerge from the low doorway, and after a calm but shrewd glance at his visitor, came forward and stood before Kāra. "Allahu Akbar," he said, spreading wide his arms in greeting. "The stranger is welcome to all that I possess." "May Allah bless and guard the habitation of the mighty sheik," responded Kāra in purest Arabic. Then the sheik sat cross-legged upon the ground, facing his guest, and also removed his red morocco slippers. His beard was grey, and his eyes black and piercing. His frame was lean, and the flesh hard as iron, denoting great strength. He wore the green turban that proved he had made the Mecca pilgrimage. "It pleases me that I behold the mighty Sheik Antar, beloved of Allah, and the curse of all enemies of the Prophet," began Kāra after a brief silence, during which the men eyed each other earnestly. "My brother speaks well," was the grave reply. "Yet so lost am I in wonder at the glory and honor conferred upon my humble home by his presence, that the exalted name of my guest escapes my fickle memory." Kāra bowed to the ground. "I am of Gabel Abu Feda, the grandson of the Princess Hatatcha, and descended from the line of Adka Ra and the royal kings of ancient Egypt. My name is Kāra." With dignified gesture the sheik extended his hand and clasped that of the stranger. "The fame of the last great Egyptian has already reached my ears," said he. "Rashid, the Syrian dragoman, whose boat, the Rameses, was here but 3 days since, told me of your life in Cairo, of your magnificence and vast riches, of your generosity and wisdom. Fedah I know, for the Sheik of Al-Kusiyeh is my comrade. The glory of Kāra the Egyptian is reflected upon every dweller upon the Nile bank." After another pause to permit of due and deliberate appreciation of this compliment, Kāra drew a heavy sigh and responded: "Yet all is not at peace with me, most noble Antar. My enemies oppress me and cause me much sorrow, wherefore I am driven to appeal to my brother for aid." The eyes of the sheik sparkled. "Already," said he, "confusion has fallen upon Kāra's foes, for they surely cannot escape the blight of Antar's hatred." "Then see how gratitude flows from my heart like a very cataract," answered the other with downcast eyes. "It is little that Kāra can do to repay such brotherly love, but the great sheik must distribute for me 10,000 piastres to his worthy poor, even on that day when my enemies are confounded." Antar's brow was thoughtful. A great payment meant a great service. "My brother will tell me a story," said he, "and I will listen." Thereupon, in the flowery language of Arabia, which English words but feebly translate, the Egyptian told of a boat steaming slowly up the Nile and bearing his enemies toward the village of Beni Hassan. He described the women and the men, and noticed that the sheik grunted with discouraging emphasis when Winston Bey's name was mentioned. Then, following out the idea of relating a tale, Kāra told how his brother, the almighty Sheik Antar, fell upon the dahabeah and captured it, turning over all the passengers and crew to Kāra except one, Tadros the dragoman being unfortunately killed and dropped overboard to find a final resting place in the mud at the river's bottom. Then Winston's crew was replaced by 6 strong men of Beni Hassan, who obeyed Kāra's commands as willingly as if they proceeded from Antar himself. And Kāra afterwards steamed up the Nile to Fedah, with the sheik on board, and at Fedah gave to him not only the 10,000 piastres for his poor, but many gems of fabulous worth for his personal adornment and that of his women. Was it not a pretty story? He concluded. And did it not sound like a prophecy in Antar's discerning ears? The sheik considered long and earnestly. He did not like meddling with Winston Bey, whom he knew of old and respected highly. But Kāra's allusion to the gems was irresistible, and Antar might discover a way to keep from being recognized by the scientist. It required several hours to conclude the bargain, but at last both men thoroughly understood the details of the service that was required and must be rendered. The assault upon the dahabeah was discussed and planned, and the terms of payment agreed upon. The killing of Tadros was an incident that the sheik accepted without demur. With two clever rascals such as the Egyptian and the Arab in charge of the raid, there seemed little hope that Winston Bey's unsuspecting party could escape absolute destruction. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 21, Lotus Eaters and Crocodiles. If in all the realm of travel there is a voyage that is absolutely ideal, it is the trip up the Nile. The constant change of scene, varying with every bend in the river, the shifting lights, the gentle ripple of the waters, the distant songs and shouts of the native boatmen, the outlines of the Libyan hills by moonlight, and the rocky wastes of desert, dotted with gorgeous crimson and yellow cacti by day, the sunsets that paint the cloudless Egyptian skies with entrancing splendor, and the silhouettes of donkey and camel trains above the high embankment at twilight. These, taken in connection with the carefree, lotus-eating existence of the voyager, leave an impression so vivid and sweet and altogether satisfactory that no other experience in the whole world of travel can compare with or ever efface it from one's memory. Aneth believed the dragoman's assertion that Prince Kāra had been generous at last and released her from her promise. Neither Winston nor Mrs. Everingham dared vouch for the dragoman's statements, but they remained silent while Tadros, unabashed, explained that his master was whimsical and erratic, but very kind-hearted and considerate, and incapable of wronging anyone in any way. As for Lord Roane, miss, he said confidentially, there is no doubt he did an imprudent thing, which vexed my master, who has a high sense of honor. So he frightened my lord, to teach him to be more careful in the future, but never had he the slightest idea of exposing him to public infamy, I assure you. Kāra has told me so himself. The dragoman derived much satisfaction from these inventions, especially as he noticed how implicitly Aneth believed them, and how they operated to cheer her spirits and render her content with her novel and delightful surroundings. Everyone on board was devoted to the girl, and under the genial influences of the voyage she recovered to an extent her old brightness and vivacity. There was no harm now in blushing happily at the love-light in Gerald's eyes, and her three companions were those she loved best in all the world. Her recent cares and heartaches seemed all to have been left behind in Cairo, and she could look forward to many weeks of keen enjoyment. She was sorry, however, that she had misjudged Prince Kāra, and promised herself to implore his pardon immediately on her return to Cairo. Gerald and Mrs. Everingham, while they did not disabuse Aneth's mind, were a trifle uneasy at the growing audacity of the dragoman's statements, and warned him to be more careful. After the girl had regained her health and self-possession, they would explain to her the truth of the matter, and discredit Tadros freely. At present they were content to note her bright eyes and the roses creeping back to her cheeks. Lord Roane had wisely decided not to ask questions. From what he overheard, he understood that Kara was now befriending Aneth instead of persecuting her, and this being the case, his own danger was reduced to a minimum. He could not understand the Egyptian's change of attitude in the least. If Kara had intended merely to frighten him, he had succeeded admirably, and Roane told himself that the punishment he had already suffered through terror and despair was sufficient to expiate his long-forgotten sin against Hatatcha. But did Kara think so? That was a question he could not answer, but he decided to defer all worries for the present at least. Gerald Winston would have been less than human had he refrained from showing to Aneth during these delightful days how dearly he loved her and what happiness her companionship brought to him. The moonlit evenings on deck were sufficient to inspire the most bashful lover, and Gerald did not dare waste his golden opportunities. If he won Aneth at all, it must be on this trip, and under the spur of Mrs. Everingham's counsel to be bold, he soon put his fate to the test, and marveled at his success. The girl had suffered too much to trifle with her lover's heart, and her consent was readily won. It was his intention that they be married while at Luxor or Aswan, there being English churches in both places and ample conveniences for a proper conduct of the ceremony. Roane was fond of Winston, and offered no objection to a plan which would ensure Aneth's happiness, and which seemed to be defective only in its precipitancy. The project pleased Aneth as much as it delighted her lover. In her days of misery, when she thought she had lost him forever, the full value of Gerald's love had been so impressed upon her that she clung to him now, realizing that he represented the full measure of her future happiness. Still, she experienced an uneasy sensation that any unnecessary delay might prove dangerous. Her contract with Kāra, moreover, had taught her to face the possibility of a sudden marriage, and what was a hateful ordeal then would now become a crown of triumph. "Whenever you like, Gerald," she said, "I will become your wife. I could never wish for other witnesses of my wedding than my dear grandfather and Mrs. Everingham. And happiness is such a precious thing, and life so uncertain, that I have no desire to resist your proposal." "Thank you, my dear one," he said gravely. "And I think I prefer Luxor to Aswan. It will be so romantic to be wed in the old Theban city, where the Egyptian princesses once made their home, and where they lived and loved, will it not?" "It shall be Luxor," he declared. That week was one of never-to-be-forgotten delight. Even Tadros wore a perpetual smile, although this method of sweet communion between lovers was all new and amazing to him. He felt quite secure now for the first time since Kāra had asserted his power over the dragoman's destinies, and wondered, the thing being so easy, why he had so long hesitated to break with his arrogant and imperious master. As the dahabeah lazily breasted the languid current of the river, Tadros idly wondered what Kāra was doing now, and could not forbear a laugh at the thought of the Egyptian's anger and perplexity when he had discovered the flight of his proposed victims. Oh well, Kāra had pitted his cunning against the dragoman's intelligence. It was little wonder he was discomfited. On the afternoon of the 7th day they steamed slowly past Beni Hassan, their moderate progress being due to the fact that the boat tied up from every sunset to the next sunrise. Beni Hassan was a picturesque village, as viewed from the river, where its filth and stench were imperceptible, and the groups of splendid palms lent a dignity to the place that a closer inspection would prove undeserved. Aneth, seated happily by Gerald's side beneath the ample deck awning, admired the village greatly, and her lover promised to stop there on their return and give her an opportunity of visiting the famous tombs in the nearby hillside. At twilight they anchored midway between Beni Hassan and Antino, the boat lying motionless a few yards away from the east bank. The evenings are delightful in this part of Egypt, and it was midnight before the passengers aboard the dahabeah sought their couches. Tadros, indeed, being wakeful, lay extended upon the stern deck of the steamer long after the others were asleep, engaged in thoughtfully gazing at the high bank, and indulging in pleasant dreams of future prosperity, when he had added Winston Bey's £3,000 to the snug savings he had already accumulated. Presently a dark object appeared for an instant at the top of the bank, and quickly vanished against the black surface below. Another succeeded it, and another. Tadros scratched his head in perplexity. These dark objects seemed to have form, yet they were silent as the dead. He counted a dozen of them altogether, and while still pondering upon their appearance, being undecided as to whether they were ghosts or jackals, his quick ears caught a splash in the water beside the bank. They were not jackals, that was certain, for those ravenous beasts never take to the water. Neither are ghosts supposed to bathe. From where he lay, the surface of the river was scarcely a foot distant, and leaning well over the stern, Tadros managed to discover in the dim light several heads bobbing upon the water. He ought to have given an immediate alarm, but terror rendered him irresolute, and before he had time to act, it was too late to arouse his fellow passengers. Clambering up the bow were half a score of naked Arabs, their knives held between their glistening teeth, their dark eyes roaming fiercely around. Tadros's first impulse was to fight, but just as he was about to rise to his feet, a man whom he knew bounded aft and sprang into the little cabin where the women lay asleep. It was Kāra. There was no indecision on the part of the dragoman after that. He slipped off the deck into the water with the dexterity of a seal sliding from a rock, and while a succession of terrified screams and angry shouts bombarded his ears, Tadros swam silently across the Nile toward the opposite shore. The water was cold, and he shivered as he swam, yet the chill was from within rather than from without. There are no crocodiles in the Nile now, but in places there are serpents and shark-like fish that will bite a mouthful of flesh from a swimmer's leg. Tadros knew of this, but did not think of it just then. Reflected in his mind was Kāra's dark visage, grim and malignant, and with certain death facing him aboard the dahabeah. The dragoman's only impulse was to get as far away from the danger as possible. The turmoil on the boat prevented his escape from being immediately noticed, and after a long swim that nearly exhausted his strength, he reached the west shore and fell panting upon the hard earth. Slowly regaining his breath, he strained his ears to catch any sound that might proceed from the dahabeah, but now an oppressive silence reigned on the opposite side of the river. The lights of the steamer gleamed faintly through the night, but the fate of those he had left on board was wrapped in mystery. Perhaps Kāra and his band of assassins would murder all except the girl. It was possible he would murder her as well. Anyway, the dragoman's connection with the enterprise had come to an abrupt ending. A mile or so away was the little town of Rhoda, with its railroad station. Tadros started to walk toward it, keeping well back from the edge of the bank so that he might not be discovered in case anyone pursued him. His dejection and dismay at this sudden reversal of fortune were extreme. He had lost the last vestige of the jaunty bearing that usually distinguished him. With £3,000 already earned, but irretrievably lost, and the knowledge that Kāra's merciless enmity would pursue him through life, the dragoman's condition was indeed deplorable. He wondered what he should do now. Returning to Cairo was out of the question. He would go back to Feta, his old home. Nephthys and her mother were there, and would hide him if Kāra appeared unexpectedly. Yes, Feta was his only haven, at least until he had time to consider his future plans. By and by he reached the station at Rhoda, the village named after the ancient island in the Nile opposite Cairo. A sleepy Arab porter was in charge of the place and eyed the dragoman's wet clothing with evident suspicion. When questioned, he announced that a train would go south at 6 o'clock in the morning. Tadros slipped outside the station and found a convenient hiding place against a neighboring house where the shadows were so deep that he could not be observed. Here he laid down to rest and await the arrival of the train. By daybreak his clothing had dried, but he observed with regret that his blue satin vest had been ruined by the river water and that his Syrian sash was disgracefully wrinkled. Next to life itself, he loved his splendid costumes, so that this dreary discovery did not tend to raise his dampened spirits. When the train drew in, he boarded it and found himself seated in a compartment opposite to Lord Consinor. They stared at each other for a moment, and then the Viscount emitted a sound that seemed a queer combination of a growl and a laugh. "It is Kāra's alter ego," he sneered in English. "Pardon me, my lord," said the dragoman, hastily. "The alliance is dissolved. I have even more reason than you to hate the prince." "Indeed," returned Consinor. "He is a fiend emanating directly from your English hell," declared Tadros earnestly. "I know of no other diabolical place where Kāra could have been bred. One thing is certain, however," he continued with bitter emphasis. "I will have vengeance upon him before I die." There was no mistaking the venom of the man's rancorous assertion. Consinor smiled and said, "It would give me pleasure to share your revenge." A sudden thought struck Tadros, a thought so tremendous in its scope and significance that he was himself astonished and stared blankly into the other's face. For a time he rode in silence, revolving the idea in his mind and examining its phases with extreme care. Then he inquired cautiously, "Where are you going, my lord?" "To Asyut." "I thought you had left Cairo long ago." "So I did. I have been to Alexandria, but found nothing there to amuse me. I am now bound for Asyut, and from there I intend traveling to Aswan and up to Wadi Halfa. Are you in any hurry to reach there?" "Not the slightest." "Then leave the train with me at Kusiyeh. I have something to propose that will interest you." Consinor studied him a moment. "Does this program include our revenge?" he asked. "Yes." "Very well. I will do as you suggest." "Good!" exclaimed Tadros. Then he leaned over and whispered, "Revenge and a fortune, my lord. Is it not worth while?" End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. The Dragoman's Inspiration. They left the train at the station opposite Feta, and the dragoman secured a native to row them in his skiff across the river. Consinor asked no questions and appeared wholly indifferent as to their destination. Indeed, his life had been so aimless since his disgraceful flight from Cairo that he welcomed any diversion that might relieve its dull monotony. When they arrived at Feta, Tadros took him secretly to the hut of old Nefert, the bread baker, which was directly across the street from the dwelling of Hatatcha, now owned by Kāra. The Viscount was inclined to resent the filthiness of the hovel wherein he must hide, until the dragoman led him to the shade of the opposite archway and explained to him something of the project he had in mind. Tadros began by relating the royal one's early history, emphasizing the fact that old Hatatcha had been able to support herself and Kāra without any labor whatever. Then he told of Hatatcha's death, and how he, Tadros, had discovered the valuable rolls of papyrus in Kāra's possession. From thence to the brilliant advent of the prince in Cairo was but a step, and the entire history permitted but one explanation: the fact that Kāra had knowledge of an ancient tomb containing great riches. "Once," said the dragoman, "Kāra and I made a visit to Fedah, but I did not suspect his errand and so neglected to watch him, being at the time greatly occupied with a certain maiden. In the morning I found he had loaded his traveling cases with treasures, wonderful gems that have enabled him to live in princely fashion ever since." "Where did he get them?" asked Consinor, eagerly. "As I said, from some hidden tomb, the secret of which is known only to himself. Do you think he has carried all the treasure away?" "I have reason to believe that more remains than has ever been taken. Once, in an unguarded moment, Kāra told me that he could not spend it all in 1,000 years. Do you suppose we can discover this tomb?" "Yes, if we are clever. It is no use to hunt without a clue. But Kāra will furnish us the clue we need." "In what way?" the Viscount inquired. "He is coming here presently." Consinor frowned. "I do not care to meet him," he said, hastily. "Nor do I," rejoined Tadros, with a shudder. "But it will not be necessary for us to meet Kāra, who will not suspect we are in the village." "What then?" "He is coming to secure more treasure, his former supply being exhausted, as I have reason to know. He has promised his tradesmen money, and will not dare delay his visit to Fedah. Besides, he is not far from here at this very moment. By tomorrow, if he comes in Winston Bey's dahabeah, he will reach this place. If he decides to take a railway train, he may be here this evening." "In that case, what do you propose to do?" demanded Consinor. "Spy upon him, discover where the treasure is hidden, and when he is gone, help ourselves," was the confident reply. The idea seemed quite feasible when further elaborated. They entered the room of Kāra's dwelling, and examined the place carefully. "This," explained the dragoman, "is doubtless his starting point. From here he has either a secret passage into the mountain, or he steals away to the desert, where the entrance to the tomb is hidden underneath the shifting sands. We must be prepared to watch him in either event, and that is why I have proposed to you to assist me, rather than try to secure all the fortune myself. I am assured there is plenty for two, and to spare." "Doubtless," replied the Viscount, laconically. Already he saw visions of great wealth, which would enable him to return to London and rise superior to all the sneers and scandals that had been thrust upon him. They discussed the matter long and earnestly, the few inhabitants of the village, stupid and inert, being entirely ignorant of their presence. It was finally decided that on Kāra's approach Consinor should conceal himself beneath the dried rushes of the old bed, Tadros so arranging his position that the Viscount could observe every action of one moving within the room. Then the dragoman would himself lurk at the edge of the village to follow Kāra if he stole away into the desert. As a matter of fact, Tadros was firm in his belief that the treasure was hidden within the mountain, but he had no intention of risking his own life when he could induce Consinor to become his cat's paw. Discovery meant death. He knew that well enough. It was better not to take chances, and if the Viscount succeeded in learning Kāra's secret, it would mean the same to Tadros as learning it himself. He knew how to handle this outcast Englishman, and if the treasure proved as large as he suspected, he could afford to be generous, and would play fair with his accomplice. Otherwise, but that could be considered later. Tadros did not desire to expose the stranger to the curious gaze of the villagers, but there was no harm in their knowing that the dragoman had come among his old friends once more. So he insisted that Consinor should stay concealed in Nefert's hovel, flying to a dark corner at the sound of every footstep, while he himself visited Sira and her daughter in furtherance of his sagacious plans. End of the Dragoman's Inspiration. Chapter 23 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Mother and Daughter. As the dragoman approached Sarah's hut, he paused upon the threshold to observe the scene within. Hesitating, he remembered that it was because of his own reckless conduct that the Nile girl had been stripped of her beautiful gowns and jewels and sent home from Cairo scorned and repudiated. Her humiliation and despair had haunted him ever since. But now he found her seated meekly at the well-worn loom, casting the shuttle back and forth with the same mechanical lassitude she had exhibited of old. The discolored black dress, open at the breast and much patched and torn, was her sole garment. Even the blue beads were again about her neck. But the eyes she turned toward Tadros were different, somehow. Their former velvety depths were veiled with a dull film, while the smoothness of her brow was marred by the wrinkles of a sullen frown. After a moment, however, she seemed to recognize the dragoman, and rose from her place with a sudden eager look and flushed cheeks. "You have come for me again?" she asked. "No," answered Tadros, casting himself upon a settle. He felt abashed without knowing why he should entertain such a feeling, abashed and sorrowful, in spite of his habitual egoism and selfish disregard of others. Nephthys leaned back and resumed her weaving. The film covered her eyes again. She paid no further attention to her mother's guest. Thera, however, was voluble and indignant. "That Kāra," she hissed, "is a viper, a crocodile, a low, infamous deceiver. He is worse than an Arab. Himph! If I had him here I would stamp him into the dust. Why did he spurn my beautiful daughter from his harem? Tell me, then." "Merely because Nephthys and I, being old friends, wish to converse at times of you and our acquaintances at Fedah. Why should we not gossip and smoke a cigarette together? Once I owned her myself." "True, you were a fool to sell her. Still, you must not forget that Nephthys has had an experience," he resumed, more lightly. "For a time she was a queen, splendid and magnificent beyond compare, in her robes of satin and her sparkling jewels. Ah, it is not every girl who enjoys such luxury, even for a brief season. Let her be content." "Content?" screamed old Sarah shrilly. "It has ruined her. She is no longer happy in the old home, and when she speaks, which is but seldom, it is only to curse Kāra. Look at her! Is she now fat and beautiful as before? No. If the poor child lives long enough she will die a skeleton." "Allah forbid!" exclaimed Tadros, hastily. "But if she expects to be taken back again, her case is hopeless. I am sure Kāra will never relent or restore her to favor. He is a poor judge of a woman, but I," slapping his chest proudly, "I will take Nephthys to myself, and while I do not promise to robe her as gorgeously as Kāra did, she shall become fat again, and have her silks and ornaments the same as before." "And the cigarettes?" "Of course." He drew a box of the coveted cigarettes from his pocket and tossed it toward her. Sarah lighted one eagerly and gave the box to Nephthys. After staring at it blankly for a moment the girl seemed to understand. She took a cigarette and lighted it from the one her mother was smoking. A smile of childish enjoyment slowly spread over her face, and she left her loom and came and sat upon Tadros's knee. "I expect Kāra in Fedah presently," remarked the dragoman, "but he must not know that I am here. We have had a falling out. I quarreled with him, and he threatens me." "Never fear," said Sarah calmly. "I can hide you in the cavity in the rear wall, which the royal one knows nothing of. There you will be safe until he goes away." "Very good," he replied. "When will Kāra come?" asked the woman. "And why does he visit Fedah again?" "I expect him tonight or tomorrow. Why he comes I do not know. Perhaps to pray beside Hadachesmumi." "Where is that?" he asked quickly. "I cannot discover," she returned. "Often I have examined their dwelling, but no secret door can I find anywhere. The tomb must be in the hills, or perhaps in the desert. There is an oasis where the dwarf Sebit lives. He was known to be one of Hatatcha's most devoted followers." "True," said the dragoman thoughtfully. "The tomb must be in Sebit's oasis. Once Kāra stole old Neko's donkey and rode there." "Was that the last time we came here?" questioned Tadros. No, it was when Hatatcha died. Then the tomb is not in the oasis. I am sure it is quite near Feta. But listen, my Sarah, if I agree to take Nephthys and provide for her, you must help me when Kāra comes." "I have promised to hide you in the old wall," she replied. "Can I do more than that?" "Yes. You must go at once to the hill and watch for the royal one's coming. Your eyes are sharp, even though you are old. He will come from the Nile, either across the river or from the north, on a boat that smokes and has no sails. As soon as you discover him you will hurry here to me, and that will give us time to prepare for Kāra. Will you do this for me? May I have the box of cigarettes to take with me?" "Yes." "Then I will do your bidding." She went away to the hill at once, leaving Tadros with Nephthys, but the girl had already forgotten his presence, and was staring straight before her, with lustreless eyes. The dragoman sighed. "It is very unfortunate," he murmured, examining her critically, "but it is doubtless true. Nevertheless, she is getting thin." End of Mother and Daughter. Chapter 24 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. The Sheikh Demirs. No one on board the dahabeah had entertained even a suspicion of danger. Winston Bey knew well the unreliable character of the natives of certain villages, but even he did not dream that the steamer would be molested or its passengers annoyed. Therefore, the surprise was complete. Mrs. Everingham, awakening with the start, heard the patter of many feet upon the deck and saw a man advancing into the cabin where she and Aneth had been sleeping. Her first inspiration was to scream, but instead she reached beneath her pillow and drew out a small revolver, with which she fired 2 shots in rapid succession, point blank, at the intruder. Neither bullet took effect, but they startled Kāra as much as her vigorous screams, in which Aneth now joined. He retreated hastily from the cabin, thus allowing Mrs. Everingham to close the door and secure it with a heavy bar provided for that purpose. The after cabin having been given up to the women, Winston and Lord Roane occupied a smaller cabin forward. Between the two were the kitchen and the engine room. As the natives boarded the steamer near the bow, their first act was to drop into the forward cabin and seize the white men before they were fairly awake. Roane offered no resistance whatever, but Winston struggled so energetically that it took 3 of the men, headed by the gigantic sheik, to secure him. It required but a few moments to bind the prisoners securely hand and foot, and then they were left in their bunks under a guard of natives, who held their bare knives in their hands in readiness to prevent any possible escape. The 4 Arabs of Winston's crew were easily overcome, and by the time that Kāra arrived forward they laid upon the deck carefully pinioned. There had been no bloodshed at all, and the steamer was now entirely in the control of Kāra and his mercenaries. "All right," said the sheik, nodding his satisfaction as the Egyptian approached. "It was very easy, my prince. The 2 white men are below, and the boat is ours." Kāra, by the dim light of a lantern, peered into the faces of his prisoners. "Where is the dragoman?" he asked. "Did you kill him, as I commanded you to do?" "We had not that pleasure," returned the sheik, "for he was not on board." "Are you sure?" "Very sure, my prince. He may be in hiding. Search every part of the steamer thoroughly except the cabin of the women." The sheik shrugged his shoulders, but gave the command to his men. They examined every possible hiding place without finding the dragoman. Meanwhile Kāra squatted upon the deck, thinking earnestly of what his future action should be, while the silent sheik sat beside him with composed indifference. When the Arabs returned from their unsuccessful quest, the Egyptian said to his ally, "Let your men watch the prisoners until morning. We can do nothing more at present." So they stretched themselves upon the deck and rested until daybreak. As soon as it was light enough to distinguish objects readily, Kāra arose and ordered Winston and Lord Roane brought upon deck. There they saw the Egyptian for the first time and understood why they had been attacked. "I suspected that I owed this little diversion to you," said Winston, glaring angrily upon his enemy. "Perhaps you do not realize," Prince Kāra, that by this lawless act you have ruined yourself and your career?" "No," returned Kāra, smiling. "I do not realize that." "These things are not tolerated in Egypt today," continued the Bey. "Not if they are known," admitted Kāra. "Do you think, sir, that I will remain silent?" demanded Winston indignantly. "Yes." "And why?" "Because I have no intention of permitting you to return to Cairo. Understand me, Winston Bey. I entertain no personal enmity toward you, but you saw fit to interfere with my purposes, and in doing so destroyed yourself, having been lawless enough to capture your boat, an outrage only justified by my desire to obtain possession of the persons of Aneth Consinor and Lord Roane. I am compelled, in order to protect myself, to silence every person aboard who might cause me future annoyance. Therefore, it is necessary to kill you." "You dare not." "You misjudge me," answered Kāra coolly. "But I shall be glad to furnish you immediate proof of my sincerity." Turning to Antar, he said, "Comrade, oblige me by placing your knife in the heart of Winston Bey." The sheik did not move. "Well?" cried Kāra impatiently. "It is not in the compact," returned the imperturbable Arab. "You are wrong," said the Egyptian sharply. "It was fully understood you should obey my commands, especially as to killing those of my enemies whom I desire to silence." "My brother will remember," returned the sheik, "that there was also another understanding, a little matter relating to certain jewels and piastres." "You shall have them, and you shall be obeyed when I have them." Winston smiled, and Kāra saw it and uttered a curse. "Will you thwart me now, when it is too late for either of us to retreat with safety?" he asked Antar, angrily. "By no means. I do not object to the killing, believe me, my brother. But my people are poor, and the money you have promised them will do much to ease their sufferings. Let me but see the gems and the piastres, and all your desires shall be gratified." Winston looked at the gigantic Arab closely. He seemed to remember the man, but could not place him, for Antar had not only trimmed his gray beard, but had dyed it a deep black. Still, all natives are crafty and covetous, and the words he had overheard gave him an idea. "Listen, my sheik," he said in Arabic. "If it is money you wish, I will double Kāra's offer to you. It is but natural that a man will pay more for life than another will pay for revenge. State your price, and the sum shall be yours." Antar turned toward the Egyptian, an expression of satisfaction upon his keen features. "My brother will answer," he said. "This is absurd," declared Kāra. "Winston Bey but trifles with you. His money is all in Cairo. When you go there to get it, he will throw you into prison, and your people will be destroyed and their houses torn down to satisfy the government police." "The noble sheik is no fool," observed Winston. "He will keep us in his power, closely guarded, until he is sent to Cairo and obtain the money. Also, I will promise not to betray him, and my word is as good as that of Prince Kāra." "But why should he go to Cairo at all?" asked the Egyptian. "If he will but come with me to Fedah he shall have his price. Not all of Winston Bey's wealth can approach the magnificence of the treasure I will place in Antar's hands." The eyes of the sheik sparkled. "Good!" he exclaimed. "You will be faithful to me?" asked Kāra. "Why not? There is much treasure at my command. Not a mere handful of gems shall be yours, but enough to make your tribe wealthy for all time to come." "I believe that my brother speaks the truth." "Then," said Kāra, relieved, "I ask you to kill Winston Bey as a proof of your confidence in me. The others may live until we get to Fedah." "Tah! What is the use of dividing the ceremony?" returned the sheik, with a gesture of indifference. "I like not this pig sticking in sections. It means cleaning one's knife several times instead of once. Be patient, my brother. When we have arrived at Fedah and our friendship is further cemented by your royal generosity, then I will accomplish all the killing in a brief space, and have done with it. Is it not so?" Kāra hesitated, but saw clearly that the wily sheik would not trust him. Moreover, he feared that Winston's eager offers to outbid him, if persistently repeated, might prove effectual unless he carried out his own promises to the greedy Arab. He had not expected to pay Antar any great price for his services, and in the beginning intended that the handful of gems would be a very small one. But Antar had entrapped him cleverly, and he now realized he must expend an exorbitant sum to induce the old sheik to obey his orders. After all, that did not matter. The entire treasure had been Hatatcha's before it descended to him, and a portion of it would be well expended in securing her vengeance. He alone knew that the hoard was practically inexhaustible, and he might even bury the big Arab in jewels and golden ornaments, and still have left more than he could use in his own lifetime. So he agreed, with assumed content, to Antar's proposition, and Abdallah, the engineer, was released from his bonds and instructed to start the dahabeah upon its voyage up the river. It would be 30 hours before they could hope to reach Fedah. Roane and Winston were permitted to remain upon deck, but were tied to their chairs and carefully guarded. Breakfast was served, and Kāra accompanied the Arab who carried the tray to the cabin of the women. The Egyptian had not disturbed them since the night before, well knowing they had made themselves as secure as he could have done. He rapped boldly upon the door and said, "Let me in." "Who is it?" asked Mrs. Everingham. "Prince Kāra. By what right do you annoy us with your presence aboard this boat?" she continued. "That I will explain when you permit me to see you," he answered. For a few moments there was silence. "Your breakfast is here, and the servant is waiting for you to open the door," continued Kāra. Somewhat to his surprise the bar was removed, and Annette threw the door wide open. "One moment, please," cried Mrs. Everingham, and as Kāra was about to enter he saw the lady standing in the middle of the cabin with her revolver pointed toward him. "I was so startled last night that I missed you," she said, calmly, "but I am almost certain I can shoot straight this morning." Kāra shrank back a little. "Why do you fear me?" he asked. "I don't," she answered. "It is you who fear, and with reason. But I do not trust you, because you have convinced me that you are a consummate scoundrel. If you have anything to say to me or Miss Consinor, we are prepared to hear it. Otherwise you had better go, for I am extremely nervous and my finger is upon the trigger." "I have taken possession of this steamer," he announced. "All on board are now my prisoners." "How dramatic!" she returned, with a laugh. "May I ask what you intend to do with us? Will you scuttle the ship, or raise the black flag and become a modern pirate of the Nile? Come, my buccaneer, confide to us your secret." "In due time, madam, you shall know all, and more, perhaps, than will please you," he answered, furious at her gibes. "One thing, however, is certain, Miss Consinor," and here he cast an evil glare at the girl, who stood with white face in the background, "shall not escape me again. I intend to take her to Cairo and keep her secure in my villa. As for you, Mrs. Everingham, your life hangs by a thread. If I could depend upon your discretion and silence I might spare you. But you are clever enough to understand that I cannot afford to take chances of future accusations." "My man," replied Mrs. Everingham, "your own miserable life is at this moment not worth a farthing's purchase. If you dare to molest this girl or me again, or even show your ugly face in this cabin, I swear to shoot you upon the spot. Here, Selim, bring in that tray. Place it on the table. That will do. Now, Prince Kāra, I will give you 1 minute to disappear." That was too long. He was gone in an instant, his face contorted with rage as he cursed the woman who had so successfully defied him. On deck he met the sheik. "Tell the engineer to urge the boat forward," he said. "We must keep moving day and night until we reach Gebel Abu Fedah." "Very good," responded the sheik. "I am even more impatient than you are, my brother. It is only the prisoners, who have been watching us sharpen our knives, that are in no hurry." End of The Sheik Demurs.
Chapter 25 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 25. The Bronze Bolts. Old Sarah kept watch faithfully that day and the next at her post of observation on the hill, finding solace through the tedium of the hours in an occasional cigarette from her precious box. Soon after noon of the second day she hurried to Tadros. "He is coming," she said. The dragoman sprang up. "From which direction?" he inquired. "From down the river. He is in the steamboat, and in half an hour will be at the landing." "Go back at once," commanded Tadros. "Wait until he lands, and then come to me immediately. I will be in Hatatcha's house." Sarah obeyed, and, to the dragoman's surprise, Nephthys followed her mother to the hill. The girl had roused herself when the old woman returned, and seemed to comprehend, from the eager conversation and the dragoman's orders, that Kāra was coming. She said nothing, however, but hastened after her mother and took a position beside her on the height, commanding the river. Tadros ran to the house of Hatatcha, where Consinor, having rebelled at the confinement in old Nefert's hovel, had that morning installed himself. It was as safe a refuge as the other, for none of the villagers ventured to enter the grim archway, and so long as the Viscount escaped observation, Tadros was content. There was little cheer in the gloomy room, however, and Consinor had begun to believe that he could scarcely be recompensed for the miserable hours of waiting by the promised reward when, to his infinite relief, his fellow conspirator entered to announce that the long-anticipated time for action had arrived. "There is not a moment to be lost," said Tadros. "Get under the rushes. Quick." The Viscount immediately burrowed beneath the dry rushes, and the dragoman placed him in such a position that his head was elevated slightly and rested against the stones of the wall, thus enabling him to observe every corner of the room through the loosely strewn covering. Having safely concealed him, Tadros stood back and examined the rushes critically to satisfy himself that Kāra would have no suspicion that they had been recently disturbed. The arrangement was admirable. He could not see Consinor himself, even though he knew he was hidden there. "Are you comfortable?" he asked. "Not very." "I mean, can you remain quietly in that position for an hour or more?" "Yes," answered Consinor through the rushes. "Then I will go," announced Tadros. "Be very careful in your actions. Remember that a fortune for both of us hinges upon the events of the next hour, and we must make no mistake. I go to watch the street and the desert beyond. Farewell, and may fortune attend you." He left the house, dropping the ragged mat over the inner arch and then crossing to Nefert's hut. Presently Sarah came running toward him. "He has landed and is coming this way," she reported. "Very well. Go home." "The cigarettes are all gone." He tossed her another box, and soon she had disappeared within her own doorway. Nephthys was not with her, but Tadros had forgotten the girl just then. He crept within Nefert's front room and hid himself in the shadows in such a way that he could see through the hole, which served as a window, the opposite arch of Hatatcha's dwelling. Kāra entered the narrow street and looked cautiously around him. It pleased him that no curious native was in sight. The sheik and his band were in possession of the dahabeah and the prisoners, and were awaiting Kāra's return with impatience. Therefore he must enter the secret tomb at once, without the cover of darkness to shield his movements. But the inhabitants of Fedah were dull and apathetic. They were not likely to spy upon him. He glanced with pride at the ring he wore upon his finger. The talisman of Ahtka-Ra was indeed powerful, for it had enabled him to accomplish all that he desired, and was protecting him even now. Should he take this occasion to restore it to the tomb of his ancestor, that ancient one who had entreated that it be left with his mummy for all time, and had threatened with dire misfortune anyone who dared to remove it? Why should Kāra leave the precious stone of fortune in that mountainous dungeon? Why should he deprive himself of the powers it bestowed upon its possessor? It could not now benefit Ahtka-Ra, who was long since forgotten in the netherworld, but it might be of service to Kāra in many ways. Yes, he would keep it, despite the pleading and curses of that dead one who so foolishly and selfishly wished it left with his mummy. Perhaps some day, years hence, he would restore the stone to the sarcophagus from whence he had taken it, but not now. Again he looked at the strange jewel, which seemed of extraordinary brilliancy at that moment, shooting its tongues of flame in every direction. The curse? Hemph! Why should he care for the curse of a mummy when the greatest talisman of fortune in the world was his? He slipped within the archway of his dwelling and drew the mat closely behind him. Tadros had marked his every movement and now breathed a sigh of relief. For the present, at all events, the adventure was in Consinor's keeping rather than his own, and Consinor must suffer the risk of detection. The dragoman settled himself upon an earthen bench and kept his eyes on the archway. Presently Nephthys came stealing into view, treading with the caution of a cat and crouching beneath the stone arch. She did not attempt to draw aside the mat, but squatted upon the ground just outside the barrier. Tadros observed her curiously and noticed that one of her hands was thrust within her bosom as if clutching some weapon. A dagger? Perhaps. Nephthys had been wronged and might be excused for hating Kara. Should the dragoman interfere to save him? To what end? Before the girl could strike, the royal one's secret would be in Consinor's possession, and then, why, Nephthys would save them any annoyance their discovery might entail. Clearly, it was not a case that merited interference. Meantime, Consinor had noted the entrance of Kara, as well as the care with which the matting had been fastened to keep out prying eyes. It shut out most of the light also, but that bothered the Egyptian more than it did the Englishman, whose eyes had now grown accustomed to the dimness. Kara had to feel his way along the wall to the secret crypt, but he knew the location of the place exactly and soon found it. Consinor saw him take from the recess a slender bronze dagger with a queerly shaped blade, and an antique oil lamp. With these he approached the opposite wall of the room, that which was built against the mountain, and pushed vigorously against one of the stones. It swung inward. The spy saw only blackness beyond, but his first consideration was to count the stones from the corner to the opening, and then to note that it was in the third tier or layer of masonry. By this time Kara had crept through and closed the orifice. Consinor was breathing heavily with excitement. The great discovery had been made with ease. All he need do was wait until Kara came out and left the village, and then he would be able to visit the secret tomb and its treasure chamber himself. But as the moments slowly passed, moments whose length was exaggerated into seeming hours, Consinor began to feel uneasy. He remembered that Tadros had impressed upon him the necessity of following Kara wherever he went. The secret might not be all upon the surface. Fearful that he had wasted precious time in delay, he threw aside the covering of rushes and approached the wall. It was scarcely necessary to count the stones. He had stared at them so long that he knew the exact spot which Kara had touched. Responsive to his push, the great stone again swung backward, and he crept through as the other had done, and found himself confronted with blackness. The dragoman had foreseen such an event, and had thoughtfully provided his accomplice with a candle. Consinor lit it, and leaving the stone entrance somewhat ajar so that he might have no trouble in escaping if he were compelled to return in haste, he began a cautious exploration of the various passages that led into the mountain. He lost some time in pursuing false trails, but at length he came upon a burnt match, tossed carelessly aside when Kara had lighted his lamp, and it lay within the entrance of a rough and forbidding-looking gallery between the rocks. However, Consinor followed this trail, and after stumbling along blindly until it had nearly ended in a cul-de-sac, he came to a circular door in the cliff which stood wide open. Beyond was a passage, carefully built by man, into the very heart of the mountain. The Viscount paused to examine the door carefully. It had been most cleverly constructed, and fitted its opening accurately. 6 huge bronze bolts, working upon springs, were ranged along its edge, and the single hinge was of enormous size and likewise composed of solid bronze. But he could see no keyhole nor lever by means of which the door had been opened. The outer surface was an irregular rock, harmonizing with the side of the passage, but the edges and the inner surface were carefully dressed with chisels. An examination of the casing showed bronze sockets for the bolts, securely embedded in the cliff, and he could understand that when the door was closed the bolts fastened themselves automatically. But how had it been opened? That was a mystery he could not penetrate, for Kara, after unlocking the door, had inadvertently withdrawn the dagger from the secret orifice, and carried it with him into the tomb. It was a foolhardy proceeding, for if by chance he dropped the dagger inside the passage, he would forever afterward be powerless to enter the tomb again, since it was the only key to the treasure chamber in existence. Besides, the removal of the dagger from the orifice was useless, for, as Hatatcha had once explained to Kara, the door could not be opened from the inside. Consinor felt convinced that the Egyptian must have gone through this passage, so he cautiously entered the doorway. It was a long, straight way, slanting downward, and before he had proceeded far, the atmosphere became dense and stifling. Still, he decided that where Kāra had gone, he could also go, and so persevered, holding the candle above his head and walking as swiftly as he dared. Meantime, the Egyptian had penetrated to the vast mummy chamber, where, because of his haste, he neglected to light any of the bronze lamps, depending alone upon the dim illumination which the flickering wick of his small lamp afforded. He passed the bodies of Hatatcha and Tai Aten, with scarcely a glance in their direction, and hastened between the rows of mummy cases toward the upper end of the room. Here, majestically imposing, stood the great sarcophagus of Ahtka-Rā, its 1,000 jewels glittering weirdly in the fitful glare of the floating wick as Kāra held the lamp close to its side to detect the secret spring in the malachite slab that opened the way to the treasure chamber. The stone slid back with a sound that seemed like a moan of protest, and the Egyptian gave a nervous start as, for the first time, a realization of his dread surroundings flashed upon him. But he controlled himself and muttered, "Perhaps it is the ghost of my great ancestor bewailing the loss of his talisman. If his spirit could creep back from the far netherworld, it would doubtless demand of me the return of the Stone of Fortune." "Not yet, Ahtka-Rā," he called aloud, mockingly. "Save your curse for a year longer, and it will not be required. Just now, I have more need of the talisman than you have." With these words, he crawled into the aperture and descended the steps to the room below. He had brought with him 2 canvas sacks, one of which he proceeded to fill with the poorest and least valuable of the ornaments that littered the place. Even then, the tribute to Sheik Antar was far in excess of the value of his services, and Kāra groaned at the necessity of bribing the crafty Arab so heavily. The other sack was to contain his own treasure, and that he might avoid frequent visits to this gloomy place, which he began to dread, he selected the rarest of the great gems and the richest golden jewelry for himself, tumbling all together into the receptacle until it was full to overflowing, and could only be tied at the neck by shaking down the contents. The 2 sacks were heavy when he picked them up to carry them away. He suspended the bronze lamp in front of him by attaching its chain to a button of his gray coat. Then, a burden under either arm, he ascended the stairs and stepped from the orifice into the chamber above. As he did this, the weight of the treasure shifted, and he stumbled and fell heavily against the massive sarcophagus of Ahtka-Rā. The jar of the impact was enough to send the golden bust of Isis toppling from its place. It struck Kāra in the breast, upsetting the lamp and leaving him in total darkness. Then it rebounded and caught his hand, crushing it against the marble side of the tomb. The sharp pain caused by this made him cry out and cling, faint and ill, to the stones of the sarcophagus. There, motionless, he stood in the dark and listened while the bust fell into the opening at his feet and slowly rolled step by step into the treasure chamber beneath, finally adding itself with a hollow crash to the rich hoard the ages had accumulated therein. Kāra shuddered. The awful incident, the blackness that enveloped him, the clamor of the noise in that silent place, and the quiet suspense succeeding it, all conspired to unnerve him and fill his heart with consternation. The sacks had fallen from his grasp. He raised his injured hand, felt it, and gave a sudden cry of terror. The ring, containing his ancestor's precious stone of fortune, had been broken by the blow, and the talisman was gone. Gone! Then the curse had fallen. It was upon him even now, and perhaps at his side stood the grim spirit of Ahtka-Rā, leering at him through the darkness, and exulting in his discomfiture. Trembling in every limb, the Egyptian fell upon his knees and began creeping here and there upon the clammy stones, his eyes staring into the gloom, and his fingers clutching at every slight protuberance, in the hope of finding again the wonderful stone that could alone protect him in his extremity. The curse was upon him, but he would resist its awful power. He must resist, for if he succumbed now, there would be no future escape from his fate. The stone. He must find the stone. Somewhere in that vast chamber of death it lay, slyly waiting for him to reclaim it. The cold indifference that was an integral part of Kāra's nature had completely deserted him. The superstitious fear inherited by him from the centuries had gripped his heart securely and made him its bondman. He mumbled incoherently as, prone upon all fours, he shuffled hither and thither in his vain search. The words of warning contained in the tiny parchment, the solemn curse of his ancestor upon any who deprived him of the talisman of fortune, seemed alone to occupy a mind suddenly rendered witless and unruly by the calamity of the moment. The darkness was oppressive. There was no sound since the golden bust had bumped its way into the treasure chamber. The atmosphere, although fed and restored from some hidden conduit, seemed stagnant and full of the bituminous stench of the mummies. Kāra drew his quaking body about with an effort, feeling that the silence, the dead air, and the blackness were conspiring to stifle him. He found the lamp presently, but the oil was spilled and the wick gone. It did not occur to him to strike a match. If the stone is here, he thought, I shall see its flaming tongues even through the darkness. It cannot escape me. I must seek until I find it. Twice he crept around the colossal sarcophagus of Ahtka-Rā, feeling his way cautiously and glaring into the darkness with distended eyeballs. And then came his reward. A streak of fire darted before his eyes and vanished. Another succeeded it. He paused and watched intently. A faint blue cloud appeared whence the flames radiated. Sometimes they were crimson, then a sulphurous yellow, then pure white in color. But they always darted fiercely from the central cloud, which gradually took form and outlined the irregular oblong of the wonderful stone. The radiance positively grew. The tongues of flame darted swifter and more brilliantly. They lighted the surrounding space and brought into relief the glistening end of Ahtka-Rā's tomb. Kāra stared with an amazement akin to fear, for the talisman lay upon the floor just beneath the triple circlet of gold whence he had pried it with his dagger. It had not only escaped from its unlawful possessor, but had returned to where the ancient Egyptian had originally placed it, and now it mocked him with its magical brilliance. He could have reached out a hand and seized it in his grasp, but so great was his horror of the curse of Ahtka-Rā that his impulse was rather to shrink from the demoniacal gem. How wonderful was its brilliance! It lighted the sarcophagus and the wall beyond. It lighted the floor with a broad streak of yellow light. It lighted even Kāra himself, groveling before it on hands and knees. No ordinary gem could do this. It was sorcery. It was... He uttered a scream that echoed horribly through the vault and sprang to his feet, for a glance over his shoulder had betrayed the secret of the strange illumination. At the lower end of the room stood a man, holding above his head a lighted candle. He was motionless, gazing curiously at the prone form of the Egyptian, wallowing before a tomb encrusted with precious stones. But now he returned Kāra's scream with a startled cry and turned involuntarily as if to fly, when the other sprang up and advanced rapidly toward him. Down past the rows of silent mummies sped the Egyptian, while Consinor awaited him in a stupor of indecision. Then, finally realizing his danger, he dashed the candle to the ground and ran up the passage as fast as he could go. Kāra, although once more plunged into darkness by this action, knew the way much better than the Englishman and did not for an instant hesitate to follow him. The curse of Ahtka-Rā was now forgotten, the talisman forgotten. Kāra realized that another had discovered his secret, and the safety of the treasure demanded that the intruder should not be permitted to leave the tomb alive. Consinor, on his part, was slower to comprehend the situation, yet there was no doubt the Egyptian meant mischief, and the only means of escape lay up the long, narrow passage. As he fled, he collided with the huge pillar that divided the library from the mummy chamber and rebounded against the wall of the gallery, falling heavily to the ground. In an instant Kāra was upon him, his knee pressing the Viscount's breast, his slender, talon-like fingers twined around his enemy's throat. But when it came to wrestling, the Englishman was no mean antagonist. As the native released one hand to search in his bosom for the bronze dagger, Consinor suddenly grasped him around the middle and easily threw him over, reversing their positions, his body resting upon and weighing down that of the slighter Egyptian. Failing to find the knife, Kara again gripped the other's throat with his powerful fingers. There was but one thing to do in this desperate emergency. Consinor raised his enemy's head and dashed it against the stone floor. The Egyptian's grasp relaxed. He lost consciousness, and, tearing himself from the fatal embrace, the Viscount rose slowly to his feet, his brain reeling, his breath gradually returning to him in short gasps. For a few moments he leaned against the wall for support. Then, rousing himself to action, he tottered slowly along the passage, feeling his way by keeping one hand against the wall of rock. He had not proceeded far, however, when a rustling sound warned him that Kara had returned to life. His ears, rendered sensitive by his fearful plight, told him that his enemy had risen, and he heard the fall of footsteps pursuing him. But Consinor was already retreating as rapidly as possible, impelled to swiftness by the spur of fear. Proceeding through the intense darkness, at times he struck the sides of the rock gallery with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. But in the main it was a smooth and straight way, and the Egyptian did not seem to gain perceptibly upon him, being evidently as dazed by the blow upon his head as was the Englishman by the throttling he had endured. And so they pressed on, panting along through the stifling atmosphere, until suddenly Consinor ran full against the rocky end of the passage, and fell half-stunned upon the floor. He heard the pattering of Kara's footsteps, the sound indicating that the Egyptian was gradually drawing nearer, and, dazed as he was, realized that sudden death menaced him. With a final effort, he sprang to his feet, tumbled through the circular opening, and slammed the door into place with all his remaining strength. He heard the sharp click of the bolts as they shot into their sockets, and the muffled cry of terror from the imprisoned Kara. Thoroughly appalled at what he had done, he again rose to his feet and moved rapidly along toward the entrance to the outer corridor. For a certain distance the floor of this natural passage was as smooth as that of the artificial one, and before he came to the rougher portion, Consinor saw a dim light ahead that came from the opening in the wall of the room. All semblance of composure had now deserted him. His cowardice fully manifested itself at his first discovery, and he was not sure, even now that the bronze bolts shut in his enemy, that he was safe from pursuit. With Kara's despairing cry still ringing in his ears, he reached the wall, passed through the opening, drew the stone into place behind him as a further precaution, and then sped in a panic across the room. Nephthys heard him coming and thought it was Kara. As he tore down the matting and dashed through the arch, the girl rose to her feet and viciously thrust out her hand. Consinor fell with a moan at her feet, drenching the hard ground with a stream of blood. By the time Tadros had rushed to his assistance, he was dead. The dragoman, on ascertaining that the victim was his accomplice, was frantic with despair. He rushed into the dwelling and gazed around him anxiously. The room appeared to his eyes just as it had 100 times before. Kara was nowhere to be seen, and the secret that Tadros had plotted so artfully to discover was lost to him forever. "Confound you, Nephthys," he cried, returning to the archway. "You've killed the wrong man, and eternally ruined my fortunes." But the girl had disappeared. In her mother's hut she had quietly seated herself at the loom, and resumed her work at the shuttle. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Last Egyptian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 26. The dragoman wins. Antar, the sheikh, waited for Kara until his patience was exhausted. Then he left the dahabeah and came up through the sands to Fedah to discover, if possible, what had delayed the prince from returning with his promised reward. To Antar this cluster of hovels seemed mean and unattractive when compared with his own village, and these hills were not likely places for treasure tombs. He knew that the French and Italian excavators had been all over them, and found only some crocodile mummy pits. The sheik grew suddenly suspicious. Kāra's promises were too extravagant to be genuine. Doubtless he had deceived Antar from the first, and sought to obtain his services without payment. It was true that Kāra was reputed in Cairo to be wealthy, but he might easily have squandered his inheritance long ago. One thing Antar was certain of: the Egyptian prince must produce his treasure at once, or the sheik, thinking he was duped, would undertake to exact a bit of vengeance on his own account. Thus musing, he turned the corner of the hill and came full upon Tadros, who was expecting him. The dragoman's thumbs were thrust into the pockets of his gorgeous silver and blue vest. He stood with his feet spread well apart, in an attitude of dejection. His countenance was sorrowful and discontented. "Ah!" growled the sheik. "This is the man Kāra requested me to kill." "I do not doubt it," returned Tadros meekly. "It is so much easier to kill one than to pay him the wages he has earned." "Does he owe you money?" demanded Antar sharply. "Yes, and now I shall never get it." "Why not?" "Have you not heard? Prince Kāra came to this village a few hours ago, and was met by a captain of police, who wants him in Cairo for more than a dozen crimes." "What? Have you brought the police upon us?" exclaimed Antar angrily. "I? How absurd! I came here to get my money." "But they have taken Kāra south to meet a detachment of soldiers who are coming from Assyut. Presently they will return here in force to rescue Winston Bey, who is in some trouble through Kāra's actions." "You are lying to me," declared the sheik. "It is you who have set up the officers upon us. You are a traitor." Tadros appeared distressed. "You have known me long, my sheik," said he, "and have always found me an honest man. Never have I mixed with the police in any way. But do you imagine the government will neglect to watch over Winston Bey and protect him from his enemies? Ask the captain when he returns with the soldiers and Kāra. He will be here very soon now, and he will tell you that Tadros the dragoman had nothing to do with his coming here." The sheik glanced around nervously. "You say he will be here soon?" "At any moment. Something has gone wrong with Winston Bey's dahabeah, it seems, and the soldiers are to put things right." Antar fell into the trap. In common with most natives, he greatly feared the mounted police, and had no inclination to face a company of them. Quickly he ran to the end of the hill overlooking the river, and blew a shrill blast between his fingers as a signal to his comrades. Instantly his men swarmed from the distant boat and sped over the sands towards him. The sheik met him, and the whole band turned toward the north, quickly disappearing among the rugged crags of the mountains. Tadros, convulsed with laughter at his easy victory, watched until the last Arab was out of sight. Then he walked down to the dahabeah, where, in the gathering twilight, he cut the bonds of the prisoners, assuring Winston Bey and his party, with many bombastic words, that he had vanquished their enemies, and they owed their lives to his shrewdness and valor. "You are free as the air," said he. "Fear nothing hereafter, for I will now remain with you." "Where is Kāra?" asked Winston. Tadros did not know, but he suspected that Consinor, before returning from the interior of the treasure chamber, had murdered the Egyptian, whose mysterious disappearance could in no other way be explained. Not wishing to mention the Viscount's name, whose murder might involve both Nephthys and himself in trouble, he stuck to his original lie. "Kāra is fleeing in one direction and the Arabs in another," he said pompously. "I am too modest to relate how I have accomplished this remarkable feat, but you must admit I have been wonderfully clever and successful, and by remaining faithful to your interests have saved you from a terrible fate." Winston did not answer, for he was just then engaged in holding Aneth in a close embrace, while Mrs. Everingham looked upon the happy pair with moist eyes and smiling lips. But old Lord Roane felt that their rescuer merited more tangible acknowledgment of his services. "You are a brave man, Tadros," he said. "I am indeed, sir," agreed the dragoman earnestly. "When we return to Cairo, I will see that you are properly rewarded." Tadros smiled with pleasure. "Thank you, my lord," said he. "It is no more than I deserve." Just now," continued his lordship, "we are bound for Luxor to celebrate a wedding." "With Tadros for dragoman," remarked the Egyptian, calmly lighting a cigarette. "All things are possible." End of chapter 26. End of The Last Egyptian by L. Frank Baum.